What would you do if you were living in the summer of 1914 and suddenly the news made the rounds all over Europe that the war was beginning? Would you believe that this war really only lasts a few weeks, as many hoped at the time? Or would you suspect that a catastrophe is about to begin, which will cost millions of lives and change the world forever? Feel free to write your answer in the comments below, because it is precisely this question that leads us into the middle of one of the most dramatic chapters in human history. The First World War was not simply a war between states. It was a collapse of an entire era. Empires that had existed for centuries collapsed. Borders were redrawn. Families were torn apart. Young men enthusiastically went to the front and soon found themselves in mud, shelling, hunger, fear, and endless trenches. Political tensions, imperial interests, nationalism, and military alliances gave rise to a war that no one could really control. In this video, we take a step-by-step look at how it could have come to this in the first place. Why was one attack in Sarajevo enough to set almost all of Europe on fire? What role did Germany, Austria, Hungary, Russia, France, Great Britain, and later the USA play? And why did an expected short campaign turn into years of industrial mass warfare? Before we begin, feel free to leave a like if you're interested in history and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more historical analysis. Also write in the comments, in your opinion, was the First World War avoidable, or did Europe have to get into this conflict sooner or later? And with that, we enter the world before 1914, a world full of glamour, pride, and progress, but also full of mistrust, power struggles, and dangerous tensions. Chapter 1: Europe before the storm. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe seemed at first glance to be the center of the world. The big cities grew, railways connected countries and regions, factories produced at a pace that previous generations could hardly have comprehended, and science, technology, and industry seemed to promise a future full of progress. Electric light lit up streets and homes, newspapers spread news faster than ever before, steamships crossed the oceans, and many people believed they were living in a time when humanity would soon overcome its greatest problems. But under this shiny surface, tensions, fears, and rivalries accumulated, leading Europe step by step to the brink of catastrophe. At that time, Europe was not a continent of equal democracies, but a space of powerful empires, monarchies, and nation-states that watched each other with suspicion. The German Empire had only been a united state since 1871. It had arisen from Prussia's victories over Denmark, Austria, and France, and within a few decades had developed into one of the strongest industrial and military powers in Europe. In particular, the victory over France in the War of 1870 and 1871 had left deep marks. France had lost Alsace-Lorraine, a region of great symbolic and economic importance. In Paris, many politicians and citizens saw this loss as a national humiliation. In Berlin, on the other hand, France was seen as a possible opponent who could one day try to take revenge. Thus, peace between the two countries remained tense from the beginning. The German Empire under Kaiser Wilhelm II was ambitious, young, and characterized by a strong desire for recognition. Germany not only wanted to be economically strong, but also to be considered a world power politically and militarily. Many German elites were convinced that a large empire also needed colonies, a strong navy, and influence overseas. But it was precisely this aspiration that brought Germany into conflict with Great Britain, the largest maritime power in the world at the time. The British Empire spanned vast territories in Africa, Asia, Australia, and America. London dominated the world's oceans and saw its fleet as the life insurance of the empire. When Germany began to build up a powerful deep-sea fleet under Admiral Tirpitz, this was perceived as a direct challenge in Great Britain. Economic competition turned into a strategic rivalry that increasingly poisoned the relationship between the two states. At the same time, France was trying to secure its international position. After the defeat against Germany, it was looking for allies. This created a connection with Russia, although the two states were very different. France was a republic, Russia an autocratic czarist empire. But both had a common interest. They wanted to contain the German Reich diplomatically. Russia, in turn, pursued its own goals in the Balkans and Eastern Europe. The Tsar's huge empire was militarily powerful, but internally marked by tensions. After the defeat by Japan in 1905 and revolutionary unrest, it had become clear that Russia, although large, was politically and economically vulnerable. Nevertheless, his army was considered a potentially huge threat, especially from the German and Austrian perspectives. One of the most dangerous regions in Europe was the Balkans. There, the interests of several powers overlapped. The Ottoman Empire, once a formidable power, lost more and more territory and influence. New states such as Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece are pursuing their own national goals. Serbia in particular played a central role. Many Serbs dreamed of a union of the South Slavic peoples. This goal was in direct opposition to the interests of Austria-Hungary, because millions of Slavs lived in a Habsburg monarchy, including Croats, Slovenes, Bosnians, Czechs, Slovaks, and Serbs. Vienna feared that a strong Serbia could encourage the Slavic populations in its own empire to demand more rights, autonomy, or even independence. Austria-Hungary was a multi-ethnic empire that appeared powerful on the outside, but was burdened by national antagonisms on the inside. Germans, Austrians, and Hungarians were often the political center of attention, while many other ethnic groups felt disadvantaged. The monarchy tried to maintain stability, but the national movements grew stronger. For the leadership in Vienna, Serbia was therefore not just a small neighboring state, but an existential threat to the cohesion of the empire. When Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908, the conflict intensified further. Serbia was outraged, Russia felt humiliated, and the Balkans became even more of a powder keg. Meanwhile, two major alliance systems emerged in Europe. On the one hand, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy were part of the so-called Triple Alliance. On the other hand, connections developed between France, Russia, and Great Britain. These alliances were originally intended as protection. They were intended to prevent a single state from being isolated and attacked. But they also had a dangerous effect. A crisis between two states could suddenly draw many other powers into it. If Austria-Hungary came into conflict with Serbia, Russia could intervene. When Russia mobilized, Germany felt threatened. If Germany attacked France, Britain could be affected. This created a system in which local tensions could quickly turn into a European war. In addition, militarism played an increasingly important role in many states. Armies were enlarged, general staffs worked out detailed war plans, and many politicians relied more on military strength than on long-term diplomacy. In Germany, the Schlieffen Plan played a central role. It was based on the idea that in the event of a war against France and Russia, Germany would first have to defeat France quickly before Russia could fully mobilize its huge army. However, this plan required German troops to march through neutral Belgium. This meant that a serious conflict with Great Britain was already inherent in the military planning, because Great Britain had an interest in protecting Belgian neutrality and preventing a power from dominating the English Channel and the North Sea coast. In other countries, too, people increasingly thought in terms of military timetables. Mobilization did not simply mean preparation, but could be understood by opponents as an immediate threat of war. Railway timetables, troop transports, and border marches were precisely planned. The problem was that such plans left little room for patience. As soon as a crisis began, politicians often felt that they had to act quickly, because otherwise the opponent could be ready first. As a result, the military gained enormous power in moments of political tension. Diplomacy took time, but the general staffs pushed for speed. Nationalism further intensified this development. In many countries, one's own nation was glorified, while other peoples were portrayed as rivals or enemies. School textbooks, newspapers, associations, and political speeches often convey an image of honor, willingness to sacrifice, and national greatness. War was understood by some not as a catastrophe, but as a test of strength. Parts of the young generation in particular, especially in bourgeois and academic circles, romanticized war as an adventure or moral renewal. Few had any idea how much modern weapons and industrial production had changed the face of war. Many still imagined fast campaigns, clear battles, and heroic attacks. The reality of machine guns, heavy artillery, shell craters, and mass death was hardly present in this imagination. Imperialism also contributed to the growing tension. The European powers competed for colonies, raw materials, trade routes, and prestige. In Africa and Asia, territories were divided, borders were drawn, and people were subjected to colonial rule. Crises such as the Moroccan crises between Germany and France showed how quickly colonial conflicts could affect European power politics. For the governments, this was not only about economic advantages, but also about reputation. No state wanted to appear weak. Any diplomatic defeat could be seen as a loss of face domestically. This thinking made compromises more difficult. Despite all these tensions, many people believed until the end that a major war was unlikely. Europe was economically strongly connected. Trade, banking, industry, and international markets seemed to make the states dependent on each other. Some thought that a war between the great powers was too expensive, too risky, and too destructive to be fought. But it was precisely this hope that proved to be deceptive. Economic interdependence alone could not stop political rivalry, military planning, and national pride. Thus, in the summer of 1914, Europe was in a dangerous equilibrium. No large state was eager to unleash a world war in the later sense, but almost all were willing to take great risks for their interests. Germany feared encirclement by France and Russia. France wanted security and perhaps one day the restoration of its lost territories. Russia wanted to be an influence in the Balkans and a protecting power for the Slavic peoples. Austria-Hungary fought for its internal cohesion and saw Serbia as a threat. Great Britain wanted to preserve the European balance and secure its naval supremacy. Each state had its own fears, its own plans, and its own justifications. The decisive thing was that Europe was not peaceful just because there was no war. Beneath the surface, alliances, armaments programs, nationalism, imperial rivalries, and unresolved conflicts worked against each other. All it took was a trigger to ignite these tensions. This trigger came on June 28, 1914 in Sarajevo, when the Austrian heir to the throne Franz Ferdinand was murdered. But the assassination attempt alone does not declare war. It was the spark. But the powder was already ready. Chapter 2: The Sarajevo Assassination. On June 28, 1914, a tense, almost contradictory atmosphere lay over Sarajevo. The city had officially belonged to Austria-Hungary for a few years, but was culturally, religiously, and politically far more diverse than the imperial administration in Vienna would like to admit. Muslims, Orthodox Christians, Catholics, and Jews lived side by side here. Merchants, civil servants, soldiers, farmers, and students moved through streets where the traces of the Ottoman past and the Habsburg present visibly met. Sarajevo was not only a city on the edge of the empire. It was a symbol of the unresolved issues of the Balkans. Who really ruled here? Vienna? The local population? Or the idea of a South Slavic nation-state, which found more and more supporters, especially among young Serbs, Croats, and Bosnians? On this day, the heir to the Austrian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, visited the city together with his wife Sophie. Even the choice of date was highly sensitive. June 28 was Vidovdan, St. Vitus Day, a symbolically charged day in Serbian historical consciousness. He recalled the Battle of Blackbird Field in 1389, which in Serbia's national memory was associated with sacrifice, resistance, and the fight against foreign rule. For many Serbs, this day was not an ordinary calendar day, but a historical sign. The fact that the representative of the Habsburg monarchy drove through Sarajevo on this date of all days seemed like a provocation to Serbian nationalists, even if the Austrian side understood the visit primarily as a military and political gesture. Franz Ferdinand was a multi-layered figure. He was not a simple warmonger, as he was sometimes portrayed later. Although he was conservative, proud, and influenced by monarchical thinking, he was also aware of Austria's internal weakness. The empire consisted of many peoples, languages and interests, and this was precisely where its greatest danger lay. Franz Ferdinand thought about reforms that could give more weight to the Slavic peoples within the monarchy. These ideas were not born out of modern democratic conviction, but out of power political calculations. He wanted to stabilize the empire before it collapsed from within. This is precisely why he was dangerous for radical Serbian nationalists. If the Slavs were given more rights within Hungary's Austria, the appeal of a South Slavic nation-state led by Serbia could weaken. The men who waited for Franz Ferdinand that day were young, fanatical and driven by a mixture of political idealism, desperation, and violence. They belonged to the environment of the Young Bosnia movement, a group that fought against Habsburg rule and dreamed of South Slavic unity. One of them was Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb, barely an adult, in poor health, but inwardly filled with the idea of having to act for a great national cause. His thinking combined personal insignificance, revolutionary romanticism, and a willingness to commit political murder. For Princip and his co-conspirators, Franz Ferdinand was not simply a human being, a husband or future ruler, but a symbol of foreign rule. The conspirators were not completely isolated. They had contacts with circles in Serbia, especially nationalist networks that had links to the Serbian military and intelligence service. Particularly notorious was the Black Hand organization, which worked for a Greater Serbian or South Slavic goal and accepted violence as a political tool. Whether the Serbian government in Belgrade officially wanted the attack is a complicated question. What is certain is that individual forces from the Serbian power apparatus supported the attackers, supplied them with weapons, and helped them to get to Bosnia. But it is equally certain that Serbia itself was a small, vulnerable state, exhausted after the Balkan Wars, and could hardly seriously wish for a major war with Austria-Hungary. It was precisely this mixture of state weakness, radical networks, and unclear responsibility that made the situation so dangerous. The day began with a drive through Sarajevo. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie sat in an open car, accompanied by local dignitaries and security forces. From today's perspective, the security planning seems surprisingly careless. The route was known, the danger of nationalist attacks was not unknown, and yet the heir to the throne moved visibly and vulnerable through the city. Several attackers had spread along the route. The first attempt failed. One of the conspirators lost heart or could not act. Then Nedeljko Kabranovic threw a bomb at the car. The driver reacted quickly. The bomb bounced off and exploded under a following vehicle. Several people were injured, but Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were uninjured. After this first attack, the visit should have been interrupted immediately. But this is exactly where one of the tragic chains of this day becomes apparent. Franz Ferdinand was furious, but he continued the official reception in the town hall. There he is said to have been outraged by the welcome speech because he was met with friendly words, although an attack had just been carried out on him. At the same time, he wanted to visit the injured in the hospital later. This decision was humanly understandable, but dangerous in terms of security policy. The route was changed, but this change was apparently not communicated clearly enough to all drivers. Later, when the car drove through Sarajevo, a fatal mistake occurred. The driver took a wrong turn and had to stop or slowly back up. At that very moment, Gabriel Princip was standing nearby. He had hardly expected an opportunity after the failed bomb attack. Now the heir to the throne was suddenly within reach. Princip drew his pistol and fired. The shots hit Franz Ferdinand and Sophie. Sophie was hit in the abdomen, Franz Ferdinand in the neck. Both died a short time later. The last moments were not heroic, but shockingly human. Franz Ferdinand is said to have tried to address his wife and admonish her to live. At that moment, a political symbol became a dying man next to his dying wife. The murder shook Europe, but at first the public did not react everywhere with a feeling that a world war was now imminent. Assassination attempts on rulers and politicians were not unknown in the age of anarchist and nationalist violence. The news from Sarajevo was also perceived in many places as a serious crisis, but not immediately as the beginning of a global catastrophe. In Vienna, however, Influential circles saw the attack as more than a crime. They saw this as proof that Serbia posed a mortal threat to the monarchy. For them, the murder was not just the act of a few young conspirators, but an expression of a Serbian policy that wanted to destroy the Habsburg Empire from within. The Austro-Hungarian leadership had long wanted to humiliate or eliminate Serbia militarily. The attack now provided the occasion that some had been looking for. It was particularly dangerous that the decision-makers in Vienna believed that they had to act quickly and decisively. If Serbia was not punished, they feared, Austria would show weakness to Hungary. Then other national movements in the empire could be emboldened. So the monarchy was not only fighting for retribution, but for its authority and survival as a great power. But Austria-Hungary could not simply act without looking at Germany. Russia was considered Serbia's protecting power. A war against Serbia could bring Russia onto the scene. And if Russia intervened, Germany would be affected as an ally of Austria-Hungary. That is why Vienna sought backing in Berlin. At the beginning of July, the German leadership gave Austria-Hungary the support that was later often referred to as a blank check. What was meant was that Germany promised its ally extensive support, even if a crackdown on Serbia would lead to a major crisis. From the German point of view, the fear of growing Russian strength played an important role. Some military and politicians believed that a war against Russia would be even more dangerous in a few years than it is now. This way of thinking made the crisis explosive. The assassination in Sarajevo was therefore not the sole cause of the First World War. It was the trigger that set an already unstable system in motion. Without the alliances, the nationalism, the rivalry of the great powers, Austria-Hungary's fear of disintegration, the Serbian national movements, Russian interests in the Balkans, and the German willingness to take risks, the murder might have triggered a serious diplomatic crisis, but not a world war. It was only the political decisions after the assassination that turned two fatal shots into a catastrophe of historic proportions. This is precisely the real tragedy of Sarajevo. A young assassin wanted to set an example against the rule of Austria-Hungary. The leadership in Vienna wanted to punish Serbia and save the authority of the monarchy. Germany wanted to support its ally and secure its strategic position. Russia did not want to lose its influence in the Balkans and its role as the protecting power of the Slavs. France and Great Britain are watching the development with their own interests and concerns. Each actor saw himself as acting out of necessity, honor, or security. But together they drove Europe into a spiral from which there was soon no easy return. Sarajevo thus became a place where personal action and global political tension were combined. The deaths of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were a human drama. But the reaction of the powers that turned this drama into the beginning of a crisis that swept the continent in a matter of weeks. The spark had fallen. Now it became clear how dry the powder really was. Chapter 3: The Road to War. After the assassination attempt in Sarajevo, the war did not begin immediately. This is precisely what makes the events so depressing. Between the fatal shots of June 28, 1914 and the beginning of the major hostilities, there were several weeks in which statesmen, diplomats, generals and monarchs made decisions, exchanged messages, hesitated, threatened and misunderstood each other. These weeks later went down in history as the July Crisis. They show how a political murder, which at first seemed to be limited to a region, became a European conflagration through alliances, power thinking, military planning, and mutual mistrust. The path to war was not a single step, but a chain of decisions in which each actor believed that he had to act before the opponent did. In Vienna, after Franz Ferdinand's death, there was deep indignation, but also a certain coldness of political calculation. The heir to the throne had by no means been popular everywhere within the leadership of Austria-Hungary. Many had feared his difficult temperament, some had viewed his reform ideas with suspicion. But his death offered the monarchy an opportunity to take action against Serbia. For the leading men in Vienna, Serbia has been a disruptive factor for years, a small state with great symbolic explosive power. After the Balkan Wars, Serbia had gained self-confidence. It saw itself as the center of South Slavic hopes, while Austria-Hungary feared that it was precisely these hopes that could stir up the Slavic populations in its own empire. The murder of Franz Ferdinand seemed to confirm this suspicion. In the eyes of many Austrian politicians, the attack was not only a crime, but an attack on the existence of the Reich. But Austria-Hungary could not punish Serbia without risk. A war in the Balkans could bring Russia onto the scene. Russia saw itself as the protecting power of the Slavic peoples and did not want to lose its influence in southeastern Europe. After earlier humiliations in the Balkans and after the defeat by Japan in 1905, the Russian leadership did not want to appear weak again. Therefore, Vienna was dependent on Germany's support. At the beginning of July, Austria-Hungary turned to Berlin. There it was decided to give the alliance partner backing. This promise was later referred to as a blank check. Germany promised support, even if a crackdown on Serbia triggered a major European crisis. The German decision was based on several considerations. On the one hand, Berlin did not want to lose Austria-Hungary as the only reliable great power ally. For Germany, the Habsburg Empire was an important pillar in the European power structure. If Vienna backed away from Serbia, this could be interpreted as weakness and worsen the position of the Central Powers. On the other hand, fear of Russia played a central role. Russia was arming, expanding its railways, and would become militarily stronger in the coming years. Some German military officials saw a possible war as a question of timing. If the great conflict was inevitable, they thought, it might be won now rather than later. This dangerous mindset turned diplomacy into a high-stakes game. Austria-Hungary took its time before giving Serbia an ultimatum. There were several reasons for this delay. They wanted to wait for the investigations, but also avoid the impression of acting rashly. In addition, a large part of the European public was not yet prepared for war. Many people went about their daily lives. Newspapers reported on Sarajevo, but hardly anyone suspected that Europe would be in flames a few weeks later. Behind the scenes, however, a document was being prepared that Serbia could hardly accept in full. The ultimatum of July 23, 1914 was deliberately sharply worded. Among other things, it demanded that action be taken against anti-Austrian propaganda, that certain organizations be suppressed, and that Austrian officials be involved in investigations on Serbian soil. This last point in particular deeply encroached on Serbia's state sovereignty. Serbia was in a desperate situation. After the Balkan Wars, the country was militarily exhausted, economically burdened, and clearly inferior to Austria-Hungary. At the same time, it could not accept every demand without politically humiliating itself and relinquishing its independence. The Serbian response was surprisingly far-reaching. Belgrade accepted almost all demands, but rejected or restricted those points that would have meant Austrian intervention in the Serbian judiciary and administration. From the point of view of many European observers, this was a basis for further negotiations. From Vienna's point of view, however, it was not enough. Austria-Hungary did not want any more diplomacy for a long time. It wanted to set an example. On July 28, 1914, Austria declared war on Hungary and Serbia. Exactly 1 month after the assassination, the military escalation began. It was still formally a war between two states, but the mechanics of alliances and mobilizations now began to move. Russia could hardly afford to let Serbia fall. Complete inaction would not only have destroyed Russian influence in the Balkans, but would also have severely damaged the reputation of the Tsarist Empire. Tsar Nicholas II and his advisors vacillated between caution and determination. They knew that mobilization would challenge Germany. At the same time, they feared that if they hesitated too long, they would fall behind militarily and politically. Mobilization was a particularly dangerous instrument during this time. It didn't just mean drafting reservists. It set a gigantic apparatus in motion. Railway timetables, troop transports, ammunition deliveries, horses, food, command channels, and deployment plans were meticulously prepared. Once started, this process was difficult to stop without causing chaos. For the military, mobilization was a matter of hours and days. not of relaxed negotiations. This is exactly what put the politicians under pressure. Every government feared that the opponent could be ready more quickly. Diplomacy was overtaken by its own military schedules. Germany watched the Russian steps with growing nervousness. German war planning was based on the idea of a two-front war against France in the west and Russia in the east. The Schlieffen Plan envisaged defeating France quickly before Russia was fully mobilized. This meant that a Russian mobilization was not viewed in isolation from the German point of view. It immediately triggered the question of whether Germany had to act in the West first. This gave rise to an absurd but deadly logic. A crisis in the Balkans led to Russian mobilizations leading to German war plans against France, even though France had had nothing to do with the assassination attempt in Sarajevo. France, in turn, was involved through its alliance with Russia. The French leadership did not want to abandon Russia, because the Russian alliance was the most important insurance against an overpowering Germany. Since the defeat of 1871, France had lived with the memory of Alsace, Lorraine, and the fear of German dominance. President Raymond Poincaré had visited Russia shortly before the escalation, which politically strengthened mutual support. In Paris, they knew that a German attack would be likely if it came to war between Germany and Russia. At the same time, France hoped to win the sympathy of Great Britain in the event of a German attack. Great Britain was initially in a more unclear position. It was linked to France and Russia, but not in the same automatic way that Germany was linked to Austria, Hungary, or France to Russia. The British government did not want to enter a continental war lightly. Many politicians and citizens were not prepared to fight because of a conflict in the Balkans. But Britain had a central interest. It wanted to prevent a single power from dominating Europe and controlling the coasts of the English Channel. Belgium's neutrality in particular played a decisive role. If Germany were to march through Belgium, it would not only be a breach of contract for London, but a strategic threat. In the last days of July, events came thick and fast. Russia first ordered partial mobilization, then general mobilization. Germany issued Russia with an ultimatum and demanded that these measures be stopped. When this did not happen, Germany declared war on Russia on August 1, 1914. 2 days later, the declaration of war on France followed. The German leadership set its plan in motion and demanded that Belgium march through freely. Belgium refused. On August 4th, German troops marched into Belgium. Great Britain thus entered the war. The Balkan crisis had become a European war. It is remarkable how much all sides felt threatened during these days. Austria-Hungary saw its existence endangered by Serbian nationalism. Germany saw itself encircled by Russia and France. Russia feared the loss of its influence and credibility. France feared German power and saw its security in an alliance with Russia. Great Britain feared German domination on the continent and on the Channel coasts. Every state spoke of defense, security, and honor. But by wanting to secure their own security through military strength, they collectively destroyed Europe's security. The population reacted differently. In some cities there were patriotic rallies, flags, music, and enthusiasm. Especially in capitals and bourgeois milieus, the impression of a national awakening was created. Many young men volunteered, convinced that they were fighting for their homeland, honor, and future. But this enthusiasm was by no means equally strong everywhere. In the countryside, in working-class families, and among many ordinary people, worry, uncertainty, and fear prevailed. Mothers, wives, and children saw men depart, not knowing if they would ever return. The idea that the war would be over by Christmas spread, but it was based less on realistic assessment than on hope and self-deception. The socialist parties of Europe were on the verge of a moral collapse. For years, many workers' movements had invoked international solidarity and warned of a war between the rulers. But as the crisis escalated, most social democratic parties lined up behind their national governments. In Germany, the Social Democrats agreed to war credits. The idea of the class struggle took a back seat to national unity. Governments spoke of truce, of internal unity in the face of the external threat. Criticism was quickly seen as a betrayal. Thus, the First World War began not simply out of hatred, but out of fear, pride, loyalty to alliances, power politics, and a fatal overestimation of military solutions. Diplomacy failed not because no one spoke, but because the most important decisions had long been marked by mistrust and war plans. Every government believed that it still had room for maneuver, but in reality this room for maneuver narrowed with every mobilization, every ultimatum, and every declaration of war. In the end, Europe faced a war that many thought was short, but which no one could control. What was planned as a punitive action against Serbia became a great war of powers. The old order had built its own trap and had now stepped in. Chapter 4: The Schlieffen Plan and the War in the West. When the German troops were set in motion in August 1914, they were not simply following a spontaneous decision, but a military thinking that had been prepared for years. The German leadership had long reckoned with the danger of a war on two fronts. France was in the west, Russia in the east. Both powers were linked by an alliance, and from the German point of view this meant a strategic embrace in an emergency. The central question was, how could Germany win a war if it had to fight two major opponents at the same time? The German General Staff believed it had found the answer to this question in a plan that was associated with the name Alfred von Schlieffen. This plan was to quickly defeat France before Russia could fully mobilize its massive army. The Schlieffen Plan was based on a simple but risky basic assumption. Russia was considered huge, but slow. Its railway connections were less developed than those of Germany, its administration more cumbersome, its mobilization more complicated. France, on the other hand, was closer, more modernly organized, and could attack or be attacked quickly. Therefore, Germany should first direct almost all its strength against France. The West was to be decided in a huge blow. After that, they wanted to move the troops to the east to defeat Russia. In theory, this strategy sounded clear and compelling. In reality, however, it depended on conditions that could hardly be controlled: speed, perfect supplies, exhaustion-free soldiers, predictable opponents, and a political price that was underestimated in Berlin. The core of the plan was the advance through Belgium. The German-French border had been heavily fortified after 1871. France had built mighty fortresses at important points, and a direct attack through Alsace-Lorraine would have meant high losses and loss of time. Therefore, the German right wing was to reach far north, march through Luxembourg and Belgium, then penetrate northern France and encompass Paris. The French army was not to be pushed back head-on, but threatened from the side and rear. Ideally, it would be encircled and destroyed in a huge movement. The plan thought in big lines, in maps, arrows, and timetables. But he thought less about destroyed roads, exhausted horses, congested marching routes, starving soldiers, Belgian resistance, and the political effect of an invasion of a neutral country. Belgium was neutral, and this neutrality was internationally recognized. For the German leadership in August 1914, however, it appeared to be an obstacle that had to be overcome militarily. Germany demanded free passage, Belgium refused. From the Belgian point of view, it was about their own dignity, independence, and state existence. A small country should not simply become the corridor of a great power. When German troops marched into Belgium on August 4, 1914, military expediency became a serious political mistake. Great Britain, which had initially hesitated, now entered the war. London could not accept that Germany occupied Belgium and thus possibly threatened the Channel coast. Thus, the very step that was supposed to enable a quick victory in the West contributed to expanding Germany's circle of opponents. The German advance began with tremendous force. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers marched through Belgium and northern France. The movement was enormous, but it was also a burden that soon left its mark. Soldiers covered long distances on foot, often in the heat, with heavy luggage, under time pressure, and with inadequate supplies. Horses, which were indispensable for artillery and supplies, were exhausted. Railway lines had to be secured, bridges repaired, roads kept clear, and supply columns tracked. Modern war was not only a question of bravery, but above all a question of organization. Each army could only fight as far as ammunition, food, water, and spare forces could follow. The Belgian resistance was stronger than many German planners had expected. The fortresses of Liège in particular delayed the advance. Although they were eventually destroyed by heavy German artillery, the loss of time and the severity of the fighting showed that the route through Belgium was not just a march through. At the same time, there were German retaliatory measures against Belgian civilians because German troops suspected partisans or free riflemen in many places. Real and imagined attacks were mixed with fear, overwhelm, and brutal military logic. Villages were burned down, civilians shot, hostages taken. This violence shook the international public and was used by Allied propaganda to portray Germany as an aggressor and violator of international law. But beyond the propaganda, the crimes were real and shaped the image of the war from the beginning. While the German armies advanced through Belgium and northern France, France implemented its own war plan. The French Plan 17 was strongly based on the will to attack, national energy, and the idea of regaining lost territories. French troops attacked Lorraine and Alsace, carried by the memory of the defeat of 1871. But the attacks met with modern German firepower. Machine guns, artillery, and well-prepared positions made the offensive elan expensive. The French army suffered heavy losses. The old ideas of courage, bayonet attack, and moral superiority were shattered by the reality of industrial weapons. Nevertheless, France managed not to have its army decisively destroyed. The French commander-in-chief, Joseph Joffre, reacted with harshness, but also with remarkable calm. He dismissed incompetent commanders, ordered retreats, and prepared a fight back. The German right wing made progress, but it was increasingly overstretched. The original idea of a wide encirclement maneuver west of Paris was changed in practice. Under Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, the German chief of the General Staff, the plan was no longer identical with Schlieffen's original ideas. Troops also had to be deployed in the east and south. The right wing, which was supposed to be particularly strong, was not as overwhelming as the theory would have demanded. In addition, the directions of march shifted. Instead of encompassing Paris far to the west, parts of the German army moved eastwards past the city. This created a dangerous gap between German armies, which was recognized and exploited by the French. Paris itself became a symbol of national defense in those days. The French government left the capital and moved to Bordeaux, but the city remained militarily important. The military governor Joseph Gallieni recognized the possibility of a counterattack against the flank of the German armies. The episode of the Parisian taxis that took French soldiers to the front later became famous. Militarily, their significance was limited, but symbolically enormous. It showed that now it was no longer just professional soldiers and generals who were fighting, but an entire nation was set in motion. The capital, its vehicles, its citizens, and its infrastructure became part of the war. At the beginning of September 1914, the first Battle of the Marne took place. There it was decided whether the German advance would actually overwhelm France. The French and British troops, who had previously withdrawn, counterattacked. The British Expeditionary Force, initially small compared to the mass armies of the continent, fought in a disciplined manner and helped to break the German pressure. The decisive factor was not so much a single dramatic moment as the sum of exhaustion, gaps, communication problems, and growing resistance. The German armies were deep in France, but they were no longer united enough to strike the decisive blow. Moltke increasingly lost track of the situation. Orders and messages took time, the front was huge, and reality was moving further and further away from the lines on the General Staff maps. The German retreat from the Marne was not a collapse, but it meant the failure of the quick victory. The German troops returned to the Aisne and dug in. Even the Allies could not destroy the enemy. Both sides then tried to bypass the other flank. This movement was later called the Race to the Sea. But it was not a race in the sporting sense, but a series of desperate maneuvers in which each army tried to find the open side of the enemy. Whenever one side reached out to the north, the other followed suit. After all, the front lines stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The war of movement turned into trench warfare. This marked the beginning of a new reality for which hardly anyone was prepared. The soldiers dug trenches, first as temporary protection, soon as a permanent system. Between the lines was the no man's land, a space of wire, mud, shell craters, and death. The war, which many planners wanted to be decided quickly, turned into a tough fight for a few meters of ground. The Schlieffen Plan had promised to solve the war on two fronts by speed. Instead, its failure meant that Germany was stuck in exactly the situation it wanted to avoid: a long war against strong opponents in the West and East. The significance of these first weeks of war can hardly be overestimated. Here the illusion that modern great powers could control a war with a single powerful plan was shattered. The German leadership had put military necessity above political risk and thus dragged Great Britain into the war. France had survived despite heavy losses. Belgium had been overrun, but not insignificant. Britain was now part of the Continental War, and the soldiers on all sides had to realize that the promises of a short campaign were no longer credible. The war of the marching columns became a war of trenches. Strategy turned into attrition. Hope turned into perseverance. So the war in the West began with movement, speed, and enormous expectations. But in the autumn of 1914, it ended provisionally in earth, barbed wire, and stagnation. The Schlieffen Plan was more than a military draft. It was an expression of a way of thinking that believed that political problems could be solved through speed and violence. Its failure showed that modern war could not simply be planned like a maneuver on the map. People became tired, opponents reacted, small states resisted, supply routes tore down, and decisions had consequences that no general staff could fully calculate. In the West, the quick victory was lost. What remained was a years-long struggle that was to change Europe and devour millions of people. Chapter 5: The War in the East. While in the West the German advance on the Marne came to a standstill and the front slowly turned into a system of trenches, the war in the East took on a completely different form. Here Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia faced each other in vast spaces, in landscapes that stretched from East Prussia to Galicia deep into Poland, Lithuania, and the Carpathians. Unlike on the Western Front, there was more movement, greater distances, and fewer closed front lines in the East for a long time. But this vastness did not mean less suffering. On the contrary, the war in the East was marked by chaotic marches, supply problems, cruel retreats, burned villages, refugee movements, imprisonment, and violence that shook entire regions. At the beginning of the war, Russia was a power full of contradictions. The Tsarist Empire had huge human reserves, vast territories, and an army that was numerically impressive. On paper, Russia appeared as a colossus that could overrun Germany and Austria-Hungary as soon as its mobilization was complete. But behind this size were serious weaknesses. Russian industry was less efficient than in Germany, the railway network was more extensive, administration was cumbersome, and the supply of troops was often inadequate. Millions of soldiers could be drafted, but they also had to be equipped, transported, fed, and supplied with ammunition. This is exactly where the problems lay. Russia was not powerless, but it was cumbersome, and this sluggishness became a dangerous burden in modern war. Nevertheless, Russia reacted faster than the German leadership had expected. While the Schlieffen Plan in the West focused on defeating France quickly before Russia could fully mobilize its armies, Russian troops invaded East Prussia as early as August 1914. For Germany, this was a psychological shock. East Prussia was not just any province. Historically, it was closely linked to Prussia, the core of the German Empire. The idea of Russian soldiers standing on German soil triggered panic, anger, and fear. Refugees poured into the West. Reports of Russian attacks spread, some accurate, some exaggerated, and pressure grew in Berlin to react quickly. The Russian offensive was led by two armies. The First Army under Paul von Rennenkampf advanced from the east. The Second Army under Alexander Samsonov came from the south. On the map, this movement looked dangerous, because it threatened to encircle the German forces in East Prussia. But there was poor communication between the two Russian armies, personal tensions between the commanders, and significant organizational problems. The vastness of the space, inadequate reconnaissance, and unencrypted radio messages made the Russian movements more transparent to the German side than the Russian commanders were aware of. In this situation, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff were placed at the head of the German defense in the east. Hindenburg, who had already retired, became the symbolic figure of a quiet, fatherly general. Ludendorff was more energetic, more ambitious, and operationally extremely influential. Together with the staff, they exploited the weaknesses of the Russian leadership. The German troops were thrown with great determination against Samsonov's Second Army. At the end of August 1914, the Battle of Tannenberg took place. The name was deliberately chosen and historically charged, because in 1410 a German-ordered army had suffered a heavy defeat against Polish-Lithuanian troops nearby. The German victory of 1914 was later propagandistically portrayed as a late retaliation, although the historical context was more symbolic than military. Tannenberg ended in disaster for the Russian Second Army. Large parts were surrounded, tens of thousands were taken prisoner, many soldiers died, and General Samsonov took his own life after the defeat. For Germany, this victory was of enormous importance. He reassured public opinion, strengthened confidence in Hindenburg and Ludendorff, and showed that Russia was vulnerable. At the same time, Tannenberg was made a myth in Germany. Propaganda portrayed the victory as a triumph of German leadership, discipline, and military superiority. But as significant as the success was, it did not decide the war in the East. Russia was defeated, but not defeated. Its size allowed it to bear losses that would have been devastating for smaller states. Shortly afterwards, the Battle of the Masurian Lakes followed, in which the German army also pushed back Rennenkampf's forces. East Prussia was secured for the time being. But further south, the situation looked much more difficult for the Central Powers. Austria-Hungary had suffered heavy defeats against Russia in Galicia. The Habsburg army was a reflection of the multi-ethnic empire itself. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Ruthenians, Croats, Serbs, Slovaks, Romanians, and many others served in its ranks. This diversity did not automatically mean weakness, but in war it made communication, trust, and political loyalty more difficult. Many soldiers fought bravely, but the command was often cumbersome, the equipment uneven, and the strategic situation difficult. At the beginning of the war, the Austro-Hungarian leadership had hoped to defeat Serbia quickly and at the same time stand up to Russia in Galicia. This double burden proved to be disastrous. There was no quick success against Serbia, and the Habsburg troops were thrown back against Russia. The Russian army conquered large parts of Galicia, including Lviv, and advanced as far as the Carpathians. This was a heavy blow for Vienna. It turned out that Austria-Hungary was hardly able to resist Russia in the long term without German help. From the very beginning, the alliance between Berlin and Vienna was therefore not only a partnership, but increasingly a relationship of dependence. Germany had to intervene again and again to stabilize its ally. The war in the East was not only a battle of armies, but also a war against spaces, seasons, and supply lines. The distances were huge, roads were often poor, railways could not be used everywhere or were tracked differently, and entire armies could be paralyzed by lack of ammunition, bread, boots, or horse feed. In winter, cold and snow became enemies, in spring mud and soggy paths. Soldiers marched through forests, swamps, and villages, often without a clear idea of where the front line actually ran. In the West, sometimes only a few meters separated their own trench system from the enemy's. In the East, the war could roll back and forth over dozens or hundreds of kilometers. This mobility made the war particularly devastating for the civilian population. Villages were occupied, plundered, evacuated, or burned down several times. People got caught between the fronts, were suspected of being alleged spies or treated with suspicion because of their ethnic origin. Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, and other population groups suffered from changing rulers, military coercive measures, and expulsions. In some regions, the Russian army deported people it considered unreliable. The German and Austro-Hungarian occupation authorities also pursued tough control measures. The East was a space in which national, religious, and social tensions were brutally exacerbated by the war. In 1915, the center of gravity of the Central Powers shifted more to the east. After the quick victory in the West failed, Germany and Austria looked for a way to weaken Russia decisively. The Great Offensive of Gorlice-Tarnow in May 1915 became a turning point. German and Austro-Hungarian troops broke through the Russian lines in Galicia with massive artillery support and better coordinated leadership. The Russian army had to retreat far back. This retreat became known as the Great Retreat. Poland, Lithuania, and parts of the Baltic states came under German control. Warsaw fell in the summer of 1915. For Russia, this was a serious military and political defeat. But even this success did not bring a final victory. The Russian army lost territory, material, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers, but it did not disband. The Tsarist Empire retreated, accepted the loss of space, and continued the war. This created a new problem for Germany. Occupied territories had to be managed, secured, and used economically. The front was moved, but not eliminated. The war remained a war of attrition, just on a different geographical stage. The Central Powers had hit Russia hard, but they had not forced it out of the war. At the same time, the internal crisis was growing in Russia. The defeats undermined confidence in the government and in Tsar Nicholas II. When the Tsar himself took over the supreme command, his reputation was even more closely linked to success or failure at the front. Every setback now hit the monarchy directly. In the cities, supplies deteriorated, the army lacked weapons and ammunition, and the number of dead, wounded, and prisoners rose staggeringly. Soldiers wondered why they should fight for a system that could offer them neither sufficient protection nor a convincing future. The war in the East thus also became a harbinger of the revolution. For Germany, the war in the East brought great victories, but also a dangerous illusion. Tannenberg, the Masurian Lakes, and Gorlice-Tarnow showed the strength of German operations. Hindenburg and Ludendorff became national heroes and gained ever greater influence. But military victories could not solve the basic problem. Germany continued to fight against several opponents, had to distribute forces between West and East, and was economically burdened by the British naval blockade. Every success in the East had to be weighed against the question of whether it meant a lack of forces in the West. The war on two fronts remained the strategic trap that Germany had originally wanted to avoid. The war in the East was therefore a war of movement and exhaustion at the same time. He seemed less rigid than the Western Front, but he was no less cruel. Entire armies were encircled, regions devastated, populations displaced, and states internally shattered. This showed that the First World War was not only defined by trenches and trench warfare, but also by the violence of huge front shifts and the disintegration of old orders. In the East, empires fought against each other, which themselves were already showing cracks. The German Reich was looking for security and victory. Austria-Hungary fought against the loss of importance and internal disintegration. Russia defended its claim to be a great power while its society began to fall apart under the weight of the war. In the end, the East was not the secondary theater of war that it sometimes appears to be. It was a crucial space in which the future of Europe was co-decided. It was here that armies were destroyed, myths were born, alliances were strained, and revolutions were prepared. The war in the East showed a different form of modern war, less trench standstill, more movement, but just as much hunger, fear, violence, and death. And while the fronts were shifting, the political convulsion that was to bring down the Tsarist Empire in 1917 and change the entire war was already beginning under the surface. Chapter 6: The Trenches. When the War of Movement in the West came to a standstill in the autumn of 1914, a new reality emerged that would soon become the strongest symbol of the First World War: the trenches. What was initially intended as temporary protection became a permanent habitat of war. Soldiers dug into the ground to escape the artillery, machine guns, and rifle fire of the enemy. Simple holes in the ground soon became kilometer-long ditch systems, connected by trenches, protected by barbed wire, sandbags, wooden cladding and shelters. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, a line ran through Europe that not only cut through landscapes, but also transformed the lives of millions of men into a world of mud, fear and waiting. The trench was not a single trench, but a whole system. Mostly there were front lines, support trenches and rear reserve positions. In between, there were communication routes through which ammunition, food, water, wounded and orders were transported. In front of the front line was the no man's land, a destroyed space between the enemy positions. There, barbed wire obstacles protruded from the ground, shell craters filled with water, corpses often lay for days or weeks, and any attempt to cross this space could be fatal. At night, scouting parties crawled out, repaired wire entanglements, rescued the wounded, or listened for enemy movements. During the day, any movement above the edge of the ditch was life-threatening. The everyday life of the soldiers consisted of an oppressive mixture of monotony and sudden terror. Many hours passed with guard duty, trench work, cleaning the weapons, serving food, repairing collapsed walls or scooping out water. Then, without warning, all hell could break loose. Artillery fire turned the trench into a chaos of earth, with splinters, screams and smoke. Grenades tore bodies apart, buried shelters, destroyed trenches and made men disappear without their comrades being able to do anything. Artillery was the great death machine of war. Many soldiers died without ever having seen the enemy. Death came from afar, anonymously and inexorably. The barrage before an attack was particularly feared. 4 hours or even days, cannons fired at enemy lines to destroy barbed wire, smash dugouts, and demoralize defenders. For the men in the ditch, this meant an experience of utter helplessness. They could not shoot back, flee, often not even stand upright. They waited in cramped shelters while the earth shook above them. Some prayed, some wrote last letters, some fell completely silent. When the fire ended suddenly, the silence was almost worse, because it often announced the attack of the enemy infantry. Then the survivors had to rush out of the dugouts, grab their rifles and try to repel the onslaught. The conditions in the trenches were cruel. Rain turned the positions into mud channels. Water was ankle-high or knee-high, boots soaked up, clothes never really dried. In some sections, trench walls collapsed and buried men under wet earth. Rats ate on supplies and sometimes on corpses. Lice plagued the soldiers continuously, spreading diseases and making sleep a torture. The stench was omnipresent. Damp earth, sweat, smoke, latrines, spoiled food, decay and chemical residues were in the air. Those who spent a long time at the front got used to many things on the outside, but inwardly this world remained a permanent injury. The body also suffered from the conditions. One of the typical diseases was the ditch foot, triggered by permanent wetness, cold and poor blood circulation. Feet swelled, became numb, became inflamed and in the worst case could die. Diseases such as dysentery, fever and respiratory infections spread quickly. Medical care was available, but often overburdened. The wounded had to be carried through narrow trenches, sometimes under fire, often in the dark. Many died on the way to the first aid stations. Others survived with mutilations, burns, blindness, or severe mental damage. The psychological stress was enormous. The term grenade shock became known for conditions that are now associated with severe trauma consequences. Men trembled uncontrollably, could no longer speak, lost their orientation, collapsed, or were empty inside. At that time, these sufferings were insufficiently understood. Some doctors realized that the soldiers had been destroyed by unimaginable stress. Others saw cowardice, weakness of will, or lack of discipline. The military culture of many armies demanded toughness and obedience. Those who could no longer do so did not fit into the image of the brave soldier. This is precisely why many men suffered twice, from the war itself and from the accusation that their suffering was a personal failure. Despite everything, camaraderie also developed in the trenches. This camaraderie was often not a romantic friendship, but a community of survival. Men shared bread, tobacco, water, letters, fear and memories. They helped each other to bandage wounds, pulled buried people out of the earth, kept watch for exhausted comrades, and developed their own humor, which was often bitter and dark. For many soldiers, the small group became more important than abstract terms such as fatherland or glory. You continued to fight because your comrades were standing next to you, because you didn't want to abandon them, because the everyday life of war reduced every big idea to immediate survival. The relationship with the opponent was contradictory. In propaganda and orders, the enemy was often dehumanized. He was portrayed as barbaric, cruel, or inferior. But on some sections of the front, the trenches were so close to each other that the soldiers could hear the voices of the others. They knew when the other side was eating, singing, or working. Sometimes unspoken rules emerged, such as not shooting at food fetches or paramedics. The Christmas truce of 1914 became particularly well known, when German, British, and French soldiers left their trenches in some places, talked to each other, smoked, exchanged small gifts, and even sang together. These moments were rare and disliked by the military leadership, but they showed that the men on both sides had similar fears and hopes. But the machine of war was stronger than such human moments. The orders came from behind, from staffs, headquarters, and political leaders who moved lines on maps and planned breakthroughs. For the soldiers, an attack often meant climbing ladders out of the trench, walking through shot-up terrain and encountering barbed wire, machine guns, and artillery. Many attacks have already failed in no man's land. Sometimes they managed to reach the first enemy line, only to be thrown back by counterattacks. The gain of a few hundred meters could cost thousands of deaths. This logic of attrition increasingly shaped the Western Front. The trenches also changed the relationship between technology and people. The modern weapons gave enormous advantages to the defense. Machine guns could mow down attacking infantry, artillery could destroy entire sections, barbed wire slowed down any advance, and observation planes improved the accuracy of fire. The individual soldier was brave or fearful, experienced or new, but his personal qualities often played a lesser role than the technical conditions to which he was exposed. A machine gun could not overcome courage. Sacrifice could not simply make destroyed wire disappear. The war thus called into question older notions of heroism. At the same time, the trenches were not only a military place, but a moral abyss. The men lived with the knowledge that they had to kill in order not to be killed. They saw comrades die and still had to continue functioning. They often wrote reassuring letters home so as not to worry families, while they themselves lived in a world that had little in common with everyday civilian life. An invisible gulf arose between the front and the homeland. At home, newspapers spoke of victories, the courage to sacrifice, and perseverance. At the front, the soldiers knew that the war consisted mainly of dirt, noise, wounds, exhaustion, and loss. The trenches thus became the symbol of a war that had destroyed its original promises. The rapid campaign had turned into endless endurance. National enthusiasm turned into fatigue. Big offensive plans turned into a fight for meters. The trench forced people underground, as if civilization itself had sought shelter from its own weapons. It was a fortress, prison, workplace, sleeping place, and grave at the same time. It showed all the contradictions of modern war: highly developed technology and primitive living conditions, strategic planning and senseless dying, comradeship and annihilation. Anyone who wants to understand the First World War must understand this world of trenches. Not only because millions of soldiers fought and died there, but because the trenches shook the confidence of an entire generation. The men who had gone to war in 1914 had often still believed in duty, progress, honor, and fatherland. Many, if they returned at all, returned with a different view of the world. They had experienced how thin the layer of civilization could be when states focused all their efforts on annihilation. The trench was therefore more than a military structure. It was the place where the 20th century took its dark form. Chapter 7: Verdun and the Somme. The year 1916 became the year of great attrition. After the failure of the quick victories in the West and the paralysis of the front, both sides looked for ways to decide the war after all. But the longer the war lasted, the clearer it became that no army could simply break through and destroy the enemy in a single movement. The front consisted of deeply staggered trenches, barbed wire, concrete positions, machine guns, artillery batteries, observation posts, and reserves. Each attack had to pass through terrain that had already been turned into a death zone before the first step. Nevertheless, the military leaders clung to the idea that enough firepower, enough soldiers, and enough determination would eventually bring the decisive breakthrough. This logic gave rise to two of the bloodiest battles of the First World War, Verdun and the Somme. Verdun was located in the northeast of France and had a special symbolic meaning. The city was surrounded by fortresses and was considered by many French to be a gateway to the interior of the country. The region had already played a role in the Franco-German War of 1870 and 1871, and in France's national memory, Verdun stood for resistance, border, and honor. It was precisely this significance that made the place interesting for the German leadership. Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn believed that he could hit France at a point that it would not give up for political and moral reasons. His goal was not necessarily to take the city quickly, but to force the French army into a battle in which it had to use new forces. Later, this idea was often associated with the expression of bleeding France dry. Whether Falkenhayn formulated it exactly this way is historically disputed, but the basic logic of the battle actually corresponded to a strategy of exhaustion. On February 21, 1916, the German attack began with a huge artillery fire. 4 hours, shells hit the French positions, forests, villages, and fortifications. The landscape was torn up, trees shattered, earth was thrown into the air, dugouts collapsed, telephone lines tore down, and entire units lost connection to the leadership. After that, the German infantry advanced. Initially, it achieved considerable success. In particular, the capture of Fort Douaumont a few days after the start of the offensive was a heavy blow for the French side. This mighty fort, one of the most important works in the defense system of Verdun, fell almost surprisingly easily into German hands. For Germany, this was a propaganda success, for France a humiliation. But Verdun did not collapse. The French leadership decided to hold the line at all costs. General Philippe Pétain became a central figure in the defense. He understood that Verdun had to be held not only militarily, but psychologically. One of his most important achievements was the organization of supplies. The so-called Voie Sacrée, the Holy Road, was used to bring soldiers, ammunition, food, and material to Verdun without interruption. Trucks rolled day and night, roads were repaired, columns were organized, the wounded were transported away, and new units were brought in. Verdun thus became not only a battle of frontline soldiers, but also a battle of logistics. Without supplies, no courage in the world could have saved the position. The battles for Verdun developed into a hell of fire and earth. Places such as Douaumont, Vaux, Mortum, and Hohi 304 became names of horror. Villages disappeared under shells, forests became stumps, hills changed shape, and the boundary between attack and defense often dissolved into chaotic hand-to-hand combat. Soldiers fought in shell craters, in destroyed trenches, in underground passages, in fortress rooms full of smoke, dust, and the smell of corpses. Fort Vaux became particularly famous because French defenders endured there in extreme conditions, while water became scarce and the German attacks came closer and closer. Such episodes later became legends of perseverance, but behind each legend there was exhaustion, thirst, panic, and death. Verdun was not a battle in which large territorial gains were in proportion to the losses. This was precisely their cruel meaning. Both sides kept throwing new units into a room that had already been destroyed. Those who fought there did not experience the war as a movement, but as annihilation through permanence. Men were taken to the front, stayed for a few days or weeks, were wounded, killed, or psychologically broken, and then replaced by others. The French army introduced a rotation system, which meant that many soldiers experienced Verdun at some point. This strengthened the common memory, but also spread the trauma to large parts of the army. Verdun became a symbol of France's willingness to make sacrifices, but also of the futility of a strategy that treated human lives like consumables. While the French army was under enormous pressure in Verdun, the Allies were planning a major offensive elsewhere. The Battle of the Somme began on July 1, 1916, and was originally intended to relieve Verdun. British and French troops attacked along the Somme River in northern France. For Great Britain, this was the largest offensive of the war to date. The British Army had changed a lot since 1914. The small professional army had become a mass army, built up by volunteers and later by conscription. Many of the men who fought on the Somme belonged to so-called PALS battalions, units of men from the same cities, companies, clubs, or regions. This closeness strengthened cohesion, but had terrible consequences. When such an association was destroyed, the mourning hit entire communities at once. Before the attack on the Somme, British guns fired at the German positions for days. The leadership hoped that the barbed wire would be torn apart, the trenches destroyed, and the defenders so weakened that the infantry could advance relatively easily. Many soldiers were even instructed to proceed slowly and in an orderly manner, heavily laden with equipment. But the artillery fire only partially fulfilled its task. The wire remained intact in many places. German dugouts were deep enough to protect many defenders, and when the fire ended, German machine gunners were able to reoccupy their positions. What happened next became one of the darkest days in British military history. On the first day of the Somme offensive, the British Army suffered almost unimaginable losses. Tens of thousands of men were killed, wounded, or missing, many in the first few hours. They ran into machine gun fire, got caught in the wire, were hit by artillery, or found no cover in the open terrain. Entire units collapsed before they reached the German lines. For families in Great Britain, this day later meant a wave of death news that shook cities and villages. July 1, 1916 showed with brutal clarity how deadly the combination of industrial firepower and outdated ideas of attack was. Despite this disaster, the offensive was not aborted. The fighting continued for months. The Allies made some territorial gains, but any progress came at a high price. The German army also suffered severely. The Somme also became a material and human trap for them. Permanent artillery attacks, destroyed positions, lack of calm, and the need for constant counterattacks exhausted the German troops. The battle was therefore not only a British victim drama, but a battle of attrition on both sides. The German army lost experienced soldiers and officers who were not easy to replace. The defenders often stood firm, but the price was high. On the Somme, a new weapon appeared on the battlefield for the first time in September 1916, the tank. The British tanks were slow, unreliable, and technically immature. Many remained lying down, sank into the mud, or fell out. But their appearance showed that the military was looking for a means to overcome barbed wire, machine guns, and trenches. The tank was not yet a decisive weapon for the war, but it hinted at a future in which mechanization and mobility could become more important again. For the soldiers who saw these first steel colossuses, the impression must have been enormous. The war kept producing new machines, but none of them immediately stopped dying. Verdun and the Somme differed in their symbolism, but they belonged to the same logic. In Verdun, Germany tried to exhaust France in a symbolic place. At the Somme, the Allies tried to break through the German front and at the same time reduce the pressure on Verdun. In both cases, the battles devoured enormous amounts of ammunition, material, and people. In both cases, landscapes were permanently destroyed. In both cases, there was a disproportion between the goal and the victim. The maps of the general staff showed line shifts, but for the soldiers on the ground, these lines meant nothing compared to the dead in the trench, the screams in the hospital, and the letters that were never answered. The moral question of these battles is still difficult to bear today. Were Verdun and the Somme senseless massacres caused by stubborn generals? Or were they an expression of a strategic situation in which neither side saw an easy alternative? Both contain truth. The military leaderships repeatedly underestimated the strength of the defenses and overestimated the effect of their offensives. At the same time, they were under political pressure to do something. To simply do nothing meant to leave the initiative to the enemy, to abandon allies, or to make one's own population doubt the willingness to make sacrifices. This resulted in a tragic captivity. Attacks seemed necessary, although they promised little success. For the soldiers, this strategic logic was hardly a consolation. They did not experience abstract necessities, but mud, blood, thirst, noise, and fear. They saw comrades who had spoken in the morning and were no longer alive in the evening. They were sent into battles, the meaning of which often remained unclear to them. Many persevered because they had to, because discipline and comradeship bound them, because desertion was severely punished, or because they believed that the sacrifice could not have been in vain. It was precisely this thought that prolonged the war further and further. The more people died, the more difficult it became for governments to accept peace without a clear victory. The dead became an obligation to continue fighting. At the end of 1916, no decision had been made. Verdun remained French. The German strategy had hit France hard, but had not broken it. The Somme brought the Allies limited territorial gains and put a heavy burden on the German army, but it did not lead to a breakthrough. Both battles together cost hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded. Their effect lay less in immediate military successes than in the further exhaustion of all those involved. The war became harder, more bitter, and more total. Societies had to declare more and more victims, cope with more and more losses, and believe more and more in victory, although this victory seemed more and more distant. Verdun and the Somme are therefore like gloomy monuments in the memory of the First World War. They show where a world had ended up that combined industrial power, national honor, military planning, and political intransigence. Where villages, forests, and fields once stood, a landscape of devastation arose in which the 20th century revealed its cruelty. The battles of 1916 did not decide the war, but they changed the people who survived them. They shattered illusions, deepened hatred, exhausted armies, and made it clear that this war would not end with a single heroic attack. It had become a struggle in which entire societies were worn out against each other. Chapter 8: New Weapons, New Horror. The First World War was not the first war in which modern technology played an important role, but it was the war in which millions of people experienced with full force what industrial annihilation meant. The major European powers had gone into battle with armies, many of whose officers still thought in terms of ideas of the 19th century. Courage, discipline, the will to attack, and national enthusiasm were considered decisive forces on the battlefield. But reality quickly showed that modern war was characterized by machines, chemicals, steel, engines, airplanes, submarines, and enormous amounts of ammunition. It was no longer the brave soldier alone who decided on life and death, but the question of which side could produce faster, shoot more precisely, transport better, and destroy more brutally. The most important weapon of the war was artillery. It determined everyday life at the front more than any other weapon. Cannons, howitzers, and mortars fired at enemy trenches, fortresses, roads, railway stations, supply depots, and cities. Before major attacks, entire sections of the front were fired at for hours, sometimes for days. The earth shook, ditches collapsed, dugouts were buried, telephone lines torn apart, trees shattered, and villages disappeared from the map. Many soldiers died without ever having seen the enemy. Death came from a great distance, anonymously, suddenly, and often so completely that only fragments of people remained. The artillery made the war an experience of permanent insecurity. Even behind the front line, there was no real protection. The psychological effect of artillery fire was particularly cruel. Those who lay in the barrage for days lost all sense of time and space. The noise was not only loud, it penetrated the body. The ground seemed to be alive, air and earth became one, and every shell could be the last. Soldiers crouched in dugouts and waited without being able to act. Some were buried and heard the dull footsteps of their comrades above them, which they may not have been able to dig out in time. Others survived outwardly unharmed, but internally broken. The modern battlefield not only killed bodies, it destroyed nerves, language, memory, and trust. In addition to artillery, the machine gun shaped the face of war. It was not entirely new, but its effect in combination with trenches and barbed wire was devastating. A well-placed machine gun could mow down attacking infantry in a few minutes. Soldiers advancing in closed ranks or over open terrain had little chance against this firepower. The barbed wire slowed them down, forced them into tight gaps, or held them down completely while machine guns did their work. Many attacks failed not because the soldiers lacked courage, but because courage became almost meaningless in the face of this technical superiority. The war thus called old military virtues into question. Sacrifice could not break through wire entanglements. Bravery could not silence a machine gun nest when artillery and coordination failed. One of the most frightening innovations was the use of poison gas. Chemical weapons were an expression of a time when science and industry not only enabled healing, progress, and prosperity, but also brought about new forms of killing. In April 1915, German troops used chlorine gas for the first time on a large scale near Ypres. A yellow-green cloud drifted towards the Allied lines. Many soldiers did not know what was happening at first. Then her eyes began to burn, her throats constricted, lungs filled with fluid, men coughed, choked, and suffocated. The sight was horrible. Gas turned the air itself into a weapon. It not only attacked the body, but also an elementary sense of security. Breathing, the most natural act of life, became a danger. Soon, all major warring parties developed their own gas weapons and protective measures. Gas masks were part of the equipment, warning systems were introduced, soldiers were trained. But the fear remained. There were different warfare agents with different effects. Chlorine gas and phosgene particularly attacked the respiratory tract, while mustard gas caused severe burns to the skin, eyes, and mucous membranes. Mustard gas could stick to hollows, ditches, and clothing and be dangerous long after the attack. It did not always kill immediately, but it blinded people, burned them, tormented them for days, and overcrowded hospitals. Militarily, gas has rarely been the decisive miracle weapon that some had hoped it would be. Morally, however, it marked another border that was crossed in the war. The sky also became a battlefield. At the beginning of the war, aircraft were mainly used for reconnaissance. Pilots observed troop movements, photographed positions, and reported artillery targets. This was already of great importance, because if you could see the enemy, you could shoot at him more precisely. Soon, planes began to fight each other. Observation machines became fighter planes. Pilots became new heroic figures of propaganda. Names like Manfred von Richthofen became famous because aerial combat seemed almost chivalrous compared to anonymous dying in the trenches. But even this idea was deceptive. The air war was dangerous, technically unsafe, and often deadly. Machines caught fire, crashed, pilots froze to death at high altitudes or died in fragile constructions made of wood, fabric, and metal. The planes changed the war because they made concealment more difficult. Troop concentrations, train stations, artillery positions, and supply routes could be detected from the air. Camouflage became more important, movement more dangerous. Later, bombing raids on cities and military targets were also flown. These attacks were still limited compared to later wars, but they already indicated that the war could dissolve the separation between the front and the homeland. Zeppelins were also used, especially by the German side against Great Britain. Their attacks had limited military effect, but strong psychological significance. For the first time, people far behind the front had to experience that war could come to them from the air. At sea, the submarine brought a new form of threat. Submarines could lurk invisibly, attack merchant ships, and disrupt the enemy's supply lines. They became particularly important for Germany because Great Britain with its naval power erected a blockade against the Central Powers. This blockade made it difficult for Germany to supply raw materials and food. The German leadership hoped to bring Great Britain to its knees economically by attacking merchant ships. But the submarine war was politically risky. If neutral ships or civilian passengers were hit, it could cause international outrage. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 showed how dangerous this strategy was. Many people died, including Americans, and relations between Germany and the United States deteriorated significantly. Unrestricted submarine warfare later became one of the decisions that favored the entry of the USA into the war. Here, too, a recurring pattern of the First World War emerged. A weapon could appear militarily useful, but could have politically devastating consequences. Technology didn't just solve problems, it created new ones. The submarine promised to bypass British naval power, but it brought Germany into conflict with a non-European great power whose economic and military potential was enormous. Another weapon that was supposed to lead out of the impasse of trench warfare was the tank. The British tanks first appeared on the Somme in 1916. Their development was a direct response to barbed wire, machine guns, and trenches. Tanks were to roll over obstacles, protect infantry, and bring movement back to the battlefield. The first models were slow, noisy, hot, poorly ventilated, and mechanically unreliable. Crews suffered from noise, exhaust fumes, heat, and the constant danger of burning or getting stuck in a steel box. Many tanks failed before they even reached their targets. Nevertheless, some military officers recognized their potential. The tank was not yet the decisive weapon of the war, but it showed that the future of land warfare would become more mechanical. Minor technical changes also had an enormous impact. Hand grenades became indispensable in trench warfare because they could be thrown into narrow positions, dugouts, and trench sections. Flamethrowers created terror, especially in confined spaces and against bunkers. Mine warfare meant that soldiers dug tunnels under enemy lines, planted explosive charges, and blew up entire positions. At the same time, opposing pioneers listened underground for the sounds of digging. So the war took place not only on the ground and in the air, but also underground. The front became a three-dimensional space of killing. All these weapons also changed the economy. Modern warfare required enormous quantities of steel, coal, chemicals, copper, rubber, oil, wood, food, and labor. Factories were converted to arms production. Scientists worked for the military, women replaced men in factories, and the state intervened more and more in production, prices, and working life. The soldier at the front was only the visible tip of a huge industrial apparatus. Behind every grenade were mines, railways, factories, workers, engineers, administrators, and political decisions. War became the overall achievement of a society. This created a terrible moral tension. Many of Europe's technical and scientific achievements had been seen as signs of progress before 1914. Chemistry promised better medicine and agriculture, engines promised mobility, airplanes embodied the dream of flying, modern industry stood for prosperity and the future. In war, however, these forces were geared towards annihilation. Progress showed its dark face. The same rationality that produced bridges, machines, and medicines could also create poison gas, heavy artillery, and more efficient methods of killing. The First World War therefore destroyed not only human lives, but also the naive belief that technology automatically leads to a better world. For the soldiers, the new weapons meant above all powerlessness. They no longer fought only against the visible enemy, but against machines and forces from which they could hardly escape. A man could duck from another man, deceive him or defeat him in close combat. But against a grenade, a gas cloud, a machine gun field, or an airstrike, the individual body was frighteningly vulnerable. The war made man small. He reduced it to one point in a system of fire, steel, and calculation. But despite all the technology, the war remained human in its suffering and responsibility. Machines did not shoot on their own. Gas was not released on their own. Submarines did not sink without orders. Artillery did not fire without target decisions. Behind every new weapon were people who developed, approved, used, and justified it. Many did so out of military necessity, fear of defeat, a sense of duty, or the belief that the enemy would otherwise gain the advantage. This was exactly where the tragedy lay. The new weapons were not created outside the human world, but out of it. In the end, technology did not make the war shorter, but often only more destructive. Each side hoped to gain the decisive advantage with new means. But as soon as a weapon took effect, the other side sought protection, antidotes, or its own variants. This resulted in a race of inventions that intensified the war further and further. Poison gas led to gas masks, anti-tank protection against tanks, anti-aircraft defense against aircraft, convoys against submarines, deeper shelters against artillery. War was a laboratory of violence, in which every solution produced new horrors. The new weapons of the First World War therefore stand for more than military development. They show how a modern industrial society was able to put all its intelligence at the service of destruction. They made the war louder, bigger, more anonymous, and mentally more difficult to bear. They changed the battlefield and the home front, the strategy and morale, the body and the memory. The war of the armies became a war of machines, factories, and sciences. And with each new invention, it became clearer that Europe was not perishing because of a lack of modernity, but because its modernity was put at the service of a murderous conflict. Chapter 9: The War at Sea. The First World War was decided not only in trenches, on battlefields, and in destroyed villages, but also on the seas. Those who dominated the sea routes controlled raw materials, food, trade, troop transports, and access to the world economy. Precisely for this reason, naval warfare was more than a battle between warships. It was a struggle for supply, blockade, economic exhaustion, and political impact. While soldiers died by a few meters of ground on the Western Front, the maritime powers fought for something more invisible, but no less decisive: the ability of entire states to continue the war at all. Before 1914, Britain was the world's leading maritime power. The British Empire was based on the control of the seas. Its colonies, trade routes, and raw material flows could not be secured without a strong fleet. For London, the Royal Navy was not just a military instrument, but the life insurance of the empire. As long as Britain dominated the world's oceans, it could protect trade, block opponents, and protect its island from invasion. This maritime superiority was deeply rooted in Britain's political thinking. No European power was to become strong enough to seriously endanger British naval supremacy. The German Empire had challenged this order since the 1890s. Under Kaiser Wilhelm II and Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, Germany began to build up a powerful deep-sea fleet. Behind this was the desire for world recognition. Germany was economically strong, industrially dynamic, and politically ambitious. Many leading men in Berlin believed that a real world power needed colonies, influence overseas, and a fleet that could enforce respect. But from the British point of view, this was precisely what was threatening. Germany was not somewhere on the edge of the world, but directly opposite the North Sea. A strong German fleet could directly affect British security. Thus, the naval arms race became one of the major areas of tension before the war. When the war began, some observers expected a huge decisive battle between the British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet. Both sides had modern battleships, especially the mighty dreadnoughts, which were equipped with heavy artillery, strong armor, and high firepower. These ships embodied the pride of their nations. They were expensive, technically impressive, and politically symbolically charged. But precisely because they were so valuable, they were used carefully. Neither side wanted to lose its main fleet lightly. A single catastrophic blow could have permanently changed the balance of power. Great Britain therefore relied primarily on blockade. The Royal Navy increasingly cut off Germany from world trade. Raw materials, food, fertilizers, cotton, metals, and many other goods were no longer to reach Germany. This blockade was not a spectacular battle, but it was strategically extremely effective. It was aimed not only at the army, but at the entire German war economy and population. The longer the war lasted, the more Germany felt the consequences. Substitutes had to be developed, food became scarce, prices rose, and supplies deteriorated. The blockade contributed to exacerbating hunger, discontent, and exhaustion in the German Reich. This situation was dangerous for Germany. The High Seas Fleet was strong, but not strong enough to openly challenge and safely defeat the Royal Navy. A direct breakthrough against British superiority was risky. Therefore, the German leadership looked for other means to hit Britain. The most important of these was the submarine. Submarines could operate invisibly, attack merchant ships, and threaten Britain's vital supply routes. Since Great Britain was heavily dependent on imports as an island nation, the submarine war seemed to offer a way to put pressure on the British economy and population. But the submarine war presented Germany with a moral and political problem. Merchant ships were not always clearly military targets. Civilian passengers could travel on them. Neutral goods could be loaded, or people from countries that were not involved in the war. According to older rules of naval warfare, merchant ships should be warned and crews brought to safety before a ship is sunk. For a submarine, however, this was dangerous. If it appeared, it could be attacked itself. Military logic therefore urged attacks without warning. This was exactly where the escalation was. Modern naval warfare increasingly broke down traditional rules. An early example of the political explosive power of this strategy was the sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915. The British passenger ship was torpedoed by a German submarine and sank off the coast of Ireland. More than 1,000 people died, including American citizens. Germany argued that the ship had also transported cargo essential to the war, and that Britain was using civilian ships for the war. But internationally, the horror of the deaths of so many civilians prevailed. Especially in the United States, indignation grew. The incident massively worsened Germany's image and showed that military successes at sea could be diplomatically devastating. The German leadership therefore vacillated for a long time between caution and escalation. On the one hand, she did not want to drive the USA into war. On the other hand, the pressure from the British blockade increased. The longer Germany suffered, the more tempting the idea of cutting Britain off its imports with all its might seemed. Thus, submarine warfare became a strategic bet. Could Germany bring Britain to its knees quickly enough before the United States would intervene militarily? This question later became decisive for the course of the war. In addition to the U-boat war, however, the large battle fleet did not remain completely inactive. In May and June 1916, the largest naval battle of the First World War took place, the Battle of Jutland, known in English-speaking countries as the Battle of Jutland. The German High Seas Fleet under Admiral Reinhard Scheer encountered parts of the British Grand Fleet under Admiral John Jellicoe and the battlecruisers under David Beatty. Both sides were looking for a favorable opportunity to inflict losses on the opponent. For Germany, it was a matter of luring out and weakening part of the British fleet. For Great Britain, it was a matter of providing the German fleet and securing its own naval supremacy. The battle was massive, confusing, and characterized by poor visibility, smoke, communication problems, and quick decisions. Battlecruisers exploded, heavy shells penetrated armor, ships burned, men drowned in cold water or were trapped in steel rooms. The British side lost more ships and more people than the Germans. Tactically, Germany could therefore claim to have inflicted heavy losses on its opponent. Strategically, however, little changed. The British fleet remained superior, the blockade remained in place, and the German High Seas Fleet retreated back to its ports. This is precisely why the Battle of Skagerrak is often described as a tactical German success, but a strategic British victory. For the sailors, naval warfare was a world of its own. On large warships, thousands of men lived in cramped spaces, surrounded by steel, engine noise, coal dust, the smell of oil, and military discipline. Everyday life consisted of guard duty, exercises, cleaning, machine work, and endless waiting. Many sailors experienced long periods of inactivity, punctuated by moments of extreme danger. On submarines, the conditions were even tougher. The boats were cramped, damp, stuffy, and technically vulnerable. The crews lived in close proximity to torpedoes, batteries, diesel engines, and the constant danger of being discovered, rammed, shot at, or destroyed by depth charges. Those who died in a hit submarine usually had hardly any possibility of rescue. But the war at sea did not only affect soldiers and sailors. It hit the civilian population directly. In Germany, The British blockade led to growing shortages. In particular, the turnip winter from 1916 to 1917 became a symbol of hunger and deprivation. Poor harvests, a lack of imports, organizational problems, and the burdens of the war economy exacerbated the situation. Many people had to survive on substitute food. The supply situation undermined trust in the government and increased social tensions. Workers, women, children, and the elderly felt that the war was not only fought at the front, but also reached into kitchens and homes. In Great Britain, the submarine war also created fear. When merchant ships sank, there was a lack of food, raw materials, and fuel. Sailors of the merchant navy became frontline fighters without a uniform in the classical sense. They sailed along dangerous routes, knowing that a torpedo could hit their ship at any time. When Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare at the beginning of 1917, the situation worsened dramatically. German U-boats sank numerous ships, and for a short time the British supply seemed to be seriously threatened. But the introduction of the convoy system, in which merchant ships sailed together and protected by warships, increasingly reduced the losses. As a result, the German strategy lost its effectiveness. However, the decision to enter into unrestricted submarine warfare had a consequence that weighed heavily on Germany. It contributed decisively to the entry of the United States into the war. The USA already had economic relations with the Allies and was outraged by German attacks on neutral ships. When Germany now declared that it would sink ships in certain sea areas without warning, the conflict with Washington became almost unavoidable. President Woodrow Wilson led the United States into war in April 1917. In doing so, Germany had used a weapon that was intended to weaken Britain, but at the same time brought a powerful new opponent onto the scene. The naval war thus showed particularly clearly how closely military, business, and diplomacy were intertwined. A blockade could weaken armies, but also starve children. A submarine could sink merchant ships, but also outrage neutral states. A major naval battle could be won tactically and yet remain strategically inconsequential. At sea, it was not just about cannons and torpedoes, but about perseverance, international opinion, industrial production, and the patience of the populations. Towards the end of the war, the mood in the German Navy also played an important role. The High Seas Fleet had been in the ports for a long time, while millions of soldiers died on land and the population starved. In 1918, when defeat became foreseeable, parts of the naval leadership planned one last major naval operation against Great Britain. To many sailors, this seemed like a senseless sacrifice, a death ride for the honor of the officers. Resistance to this order contributed to the sailors' movement and eventually to the revolution in Germany. Thus, the fleet, which had once been built up as a symbol of imperial power, became a starting point for the collapse of the monarchy. The war at sea was therefore not a marginal chapter of the First World War. It determined how long Germany could be supplied, how much pressure Britain came under pressure when the USA entered the war, and how the mood in the societies changed. He showed the power of blockade, the cruelty of invisible submarine warfare, and the limits of large battle fleets. It wasn't every day that people fought on the seas as they did in the trenches, but the consequences were felt everywhere. Hunger, fear, diplomatic crises, and economic exhaustion combined with torpedoes, mines, cruisers, and battleships. In the end, Great Britain remained master of the seas. Germany could not break the blockade and defeat Great Britain in time with submarines. Instead, naval warfare exacerbated Germany's situation and helped bring the United States to the side of the Allies. The ocean thus became an invisible battlefield of decision-making. Not a single naval battle decided the war, but the permanent control over routes, goods, and connections. The First World War was also a modern war because it showed that power lay not only where armies stood, but also where ships sailed, ports were blocked, and entire societies depended on the currents of the world economy. Chapter 10: The Home Front. The First World War was not only decided in the trenches, on the seas, and in the battles of the East. It was also conducted in the cities, villages, factories, kitchens, schools, newspaper editors, and parliaments. The longer the war lasted, the clearer it became that it was not only armies fighting each other, but entire societies. The term home front describes exactly this new reality. The people who were not directly at the front nevertheless became part of the war. They worked for him, suffered from him, believed in him, doubted him, were controlled by him, and had to bear his consequences every day. Modern war no longer drew a clear boundary between soldiers and civilians. He intervened in the whole of life. At the beginning of the war, there was a wave of national rallying in many countries. It was not equally strong everywhere, and it was not as closed as later propaganda made it out to be, but it was visible. In Berlin, Paris, London, Vienna, and St. Petersburg, people gathered in the streets and squares, singing patriotic songs, waving flags, and listening to speeches that spoke of honor, defense, and sacrifice. Many believed that the war would be short. People thought of weeks or a few months, not years. This hope made the farewell easier, but it was an illusion. Families said goodbye to sons, brothers, fathers, and husbands at train stations, often with flowers, music, and tears. Some soldiers walked enthusiastically, others quietly, many uncertainly. But hardly anyone could imagine how deeply this war would affect the lives of those who stayed at home. From the very beginning, the governments tried to secure internal unity. In Germany, there was talk of a truce. Political differences were to be put to rest. Parties and social groups were to support the conduct of the war. Similar forms of national unity also emerged in other countries. Criticism of the war was quickly seen as weakness or betrayal. The press was controlled, news from the front was filtered, defeats glossed over, and successes highlighted. Censorship became an important instrument of warfare. The state wanted to prevent bad news from undermining the morale of the population. But this created a growing gap between official account and actual experience. While newspapers wrote of bravery, perseverance, and coming victories, families received news of death, saw the wounded returning home, and felt hunger and lack. Propaganda played a central role. Posters, newspapers, postcards, sermons, school lessons, and public speeches conveyed images of duty, sacrifice, and national threat. The enemy was often portrayed as barbaric, insidious, or inhuman. In Britain and France, reports of German crimes in Belgium served to show the war as a struggle of civilization against brutality. In Germany, on the other hand, war was presented as a defense against encirclement, envy, and annihilation intentions of the opponents. Each side told its population that it was fighting in self-defense. These interpretations were important because a long war could only be waged if millions of people were willing to accept more and more victims. But propaganda alone could not feed everyday life. The war devoured enormous amounts of material. Weapons, ammunition, uniforms, boots, railways, horses, coal, steel, chemicals, and food were needed on a scale that far exceeded previous wars. The economy had to be restructured. Factories produced grenades instead of civilian goods. Machines were used for armaments. Raw materials were controlled by the state. The state intervened more and more deeply in production, trade, and work. Prices were regulated, food rationed, factories inspected, and workers distributed. The home front became a huge workshop of war. The change in the role of women was particularly visible. Millions of men were at the front, and their labor was lacking in factories, agriculture, transport, administration, and family farms. Women took over activities that had previously often been considered male. They worked in munitions factories, made grenades, drove trams, worked in offices, in fields, in hospitals and auxiliary services. Many performed heavy physical labor under dangerous conditions. In munitions factories, they were exposed to toxic substances, the risk of explosion, and long working hours. At the same time, they had to provide for families, look after children, manage scarce food, and live mentally with a constant fear for relatives at the front. The war opened up new spaces for women, but not out of equality, but out of necessity. After the war, many societies tried to push them back into their old roles, but the experience of the war years could not simply be erased. The supply situation became more and more difficult as the war went on. Especially in the Central Powers, the British naval blockade exacerbated the shortage. Germany was dependent on imports of food, animal feed, fertilizers, and raw materials. When these supplies failed to materialize, it affected the entire population. At the same time, there was a shortage of workers in agriculture, horses were drafted for the military, fertilizer became scarce, and transport routes were overloaded. Harvests deteriorated and distribution often worked poorly. Food ration cards and rations became part of everyday life. People stood in line for hours, hoping for bread, potatoes, fat, milk or meat, and yet often went home with little. The winter of 1916 to 1917 became known in Germany as the rutabaga winter. Potatoes were scarce, and many people had to feed on rutabagas, which had previously been considered animal feed. Soups, substitute coffee, artificial fats, and inferior substitute products shaped everyday life. Hunger was not only a physical problem, but a political and moral one. Those who starved while the fighting continued at the front began to ask questions. Why was the war still going on? Why did working-class families suffer more than the wealthy? Why did some retailers seem to benefit from the shortage? Why did the state demand sacrifices but could not guarantee a fair distribution? Hunger ate away at the trust of the population. Other countries also experienced shortages, inflation, and social tensions, albeit to varying degrees. In Russia, the supply situation was particularly dangerous because of the combination of military stress, poor administration, transport problems, and political weakness. There was a shortage of bread in the cities, while millions of soldiers suffered at the front. This combination of war, hunger, and distrust of the government became a decisive factor in the revolution of 1917. In Austria-Hungary, too, national and social differences were exacerbated by supply problems. The multi-ethnic empire not only had to feed armies, but also populations whose loyalty became more fragile under the weight of war. The home front was also a place of mourning. Almost every family was directly or indirectly affected. News of death came by letter, telegram, or official announcements. Sometimes it said that the fallen died bravely for the fatherland, but such formulas could not mitigate the loss. Mothers lost sons, wives lost their husbands, children lost their fathers. Many families received no body, no grave nearby, no farewell. Death remained distant and yet omnipresent. Lists of the fallen were kept in churches, schools, and town halls. Names that used to refer to neighbors, friends, or students became entries in endless rows. The company became accustomed to death outwardly, but inwardly a deep exhaustion accumulated. The wounded made the war visible. Trains brought men back home with amputated limbs, disfigured faces, burned bodies, blind eyes, and shattered nerves. Military hospitals and rest homes became places where the front invaded the civilian space. For many people, these returnees were a shock because they showed what the official victory announcements concealed. At the same time, the wounded were often portrayed in propaganda as heroes whose sacrifices obliged the homeland to hold out. But behind the heroic brilliance was often a life full of pain, poverty, dependence, and emotional injuries. Children grew up in a world marked by war. At school, they collected metal, paper, or other raw materials, wrote letters to soldiers, learned patriotic songs, and heard stories of heroic battle. Toys, picture books, and postcards took up military motifs. The war was translated into the children's everyday lives, sometimes as an adventure, sometimes as a duty. But many children experienced hunger, lack of fathers, overworked mothers, and fear. An entire generation learned early on that politics and war were not abstract, but determined the plate, the family, and the future. As the war went on, dissatisfaction grew. Strikes, protests, and demands for peace increased. Workers demanded better food supplies, higher wages, and an end to social inequality. In Germany, strike movements occurred in 1917 and 1918, which included not only economic but also political demands. The people were exhausted by slogans of perseverance. They wanted to know what they were going to die and starve for. At the same time, the state tightened controls. Anyone who spoke openly against the war risked surveillance, exclusion, or punishment. The home front was therefore also a space of inner tension between approval, adaptation, doubt, and resistance. The churches, associations, and local communities played an ambivalent role. Many clergymen interpreted the war as a trial, a sacrifice, or a just fight. Associations organized help for soldiers' families, the wounded, and the bereaved. Neighborhoods supported each other, shared food, or took care of children. But here, too, social differences are at work. Those who had money, connections, or access to rural sources of supply got through the shortage better. Those who were poor, lived in cramped rented apartments, and were dependent on rations suffered more. The war promised national unity, but it exposed social inequality. The home front shows particularly clearly that the First World War was a total war in development. He did not yet achieve the total mobilization of later decades, but many foundations were already visible. The state controlled the economy and the public. The population was morally and materially mobilized. Women's work became important for the war. Children were ideologically included. Civilians suffered from blockades, hunger, and air raids, and the boundary between the front and home became blurred. The war was no longer fought by armies alone, but was carried and suffered by entire societies. In the end, the mood on the home front was decisive for the outcome of the war. Armies could only fight as long as the societies behind them still had enough food, material, labor, and faith. When this support became fragile, the fronts also began to falter. Hunger, grief, exhaustion, and mistrust undermined the monarchies in Russia, Austria, Hungary, and Germany. The home front was thus not only the background of the war, but one of its most important theaters. The First World War profoundly changed the people at home. He showed that modern states could not only protect their citizens, but also make full use of them. He forced women into new work roles, made children witnesses to political violence, transformed factories into weapons manufacturers and kitchens into places of scarcity. He brought propaganda into the newspapers, censorship into the language, and mourning into almost every home. While the soldiers fought in the trenches, the home front struggled with hunger, work, fear, and perseverance. And the longer the war lasted, the clearer it became. No state could win this war on the front alone if the society behind it collapsed. Chapter 11: War Goes Global. The First World War began as a European crisis, but it was never limited to Europe. The very name World War shows that the conflict extended far beyond the battlefields in Belgium, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Russia, or the Balkans. The great European powers were not only nation-states or monarchies, but colonial empires with possessions, bases, trade routes, and interests on almost every continent. As they went to war against each other, their colonies, their allies, their trade networks, and their dependent territories were also drawn into the conflict. Millions of people who had nothing to do with the assassination in Sarajevo, and often did not even have political rights in the empires for which they were supposed to fight, suddenly became part of a war whose causes lay in European centers of power. This global dimension was particularly evident in the colonies. Great Britain and France had huge colonial empires. They were able to mobilize soldiers, labor, raw materials, and money from Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Caribbean. Men from India, North Africa, West Africa, Indochina, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and many other regions served on fronts that were often thousands of miles from home. Some fought in Europe, others in the Middle East, in Africa, or on the world's oceans. For the imperial powers, these people were an important part of the war effort. For the colonized themselves, however, the war was full of contradictions. They were supposed to fight for freedom, civilization, or justice, although they were often denied precisely these rights in the colonies. India played a particularly important role for the British Empire. Hundreds of thousands of Indian soldiers served in British forces during the war. They fought in France and Flanders, in Mesopotamia, in East Africa, and in the Middle East, among other places. For many of them, the war was a harrowing encounter with a foreign world. Indian soldiers fighting on the Western Front experienced cold, mud, artillery fire, and industrial annihilation in a form they could hardly have waited for. Letters and reports show how much they stood between duty, pride, alienation, and horror. Some hoped that their efforts would bring political recognition and more self-determination for India after the war. But this hope was only fulfilled to a limited extent. In the long run, the war strengthened Indian nationalism, because more and more people asked why a country that had done so much for the empire should continue to be colonially ruled. France also relied heavily on soldiers from its colonies. Men from Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Senegal, and other parts of West and North Africa fought in French uniform. French propaganda liked to portray the colonial empire as a community in which all people stood up for France. But the reality was one of inequality. Colonial soldiers were often treated more harshly, paid less, or racially viewed, even though they were exposed to the same dangers as European soldiers. On the battlefields of Europe, they died in trenches, attacks, and hospitals. Her blood flowed for a republic that invoked freedom and civil rights in Europe, while practicing rule and subordination in the colonies. This tension did not remain without consequences after the war. The war was also fought in Africa. Germany had colonies such as German East Africa, German Southwest Africa, Cameroon, and Togo. Since Germany was largely cut off from its colonies by British naval power, these areas could hardly be supplied permanently. The Allies attacked German colonies, not only for military reasons, but also because they wanted to reshape the colonial order according to their interests. In Togo and Cameroon, German positions were attacked relatively quickly. In German Southwest Africa, South African troops fought against the German colonial power. The war was particularly long and grueling in German East Africa, where the German commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck waged a protracted guerrilla war with comparatively small forces. This war in East Africa is sometimes described as a skillful resistance from a military point of view, but for the African population it meant above all suffering. Hundreds of thousands of porters were forcibly or under intense pressure used for transport because roads and railways were inadequate and the armies needed enormous amounts of material. Disease, hunger, exhaustion, and violence claimed countless victims. Villages were plundered, crops destroyed, people forced to work. For many Africans, the war was not a struggle for their own goals, but a catastrophe brought upon them by foreign powers. The colonial violence that had existed before 1914 was exacerbated by the war. Another central expansion of the war took place in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire entered the war at the end of 1914 on the side of the Central Powers. This was an important success for Germany because it tied Britain, France, and Russia on other fronts. For the Ottoman Empire itself, the war was an attempt to halt its decline and regain lost power. For decades, it had lost territory, experienced internal crises, and felt the pressure of European powers. The Young Turk leadership hoped to strengthen its own position through the alliance with Germany. But the war became an existential test for the empire, which it did not survive in the end. The fighting in the Ottoman region had far-reaching consequences. In 1915, British and French troops tried to weaken the Ottoman Empire by attacking the Strait, threatening Constantinople, and opening a connection with Russia. The landing on Gallipoli was a serious failure for the Allies. Turkish defenders led by capable officers, including Mustafa Kemal, put up fierce resistance. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became a formative national place of remembrance, because many soldiers of the Anzac Corps fought and died there. For the Ottoman side, the successful defense became a symbol of resistance and later an important part of Turkish national history. In the Middle East, Britain pursued several goals at the same time. It wanted to protect the Suez Canal, which was vital for the connection to India. It wanted to weaken Ottoman power and at the same time gain influence in Arab areas. In Mesopotamia, today's Iraq, British and Indian troops fought against Ottoman forces. The region was strategically important, not least because of its location and because of the growing interest in oil. The war there was marked by heat, disease, long supply routes, and serious mistakes by the British leadership. The defeat at Kut in 1916, when a British Indian troop had to capitulate, was a serious setback. Later, however, Britain managed to take Baghdad and strengthen its position in the region. At the same time, Great Britain supported Arab uprising movements against the Ottomans. The Arab Revolt, associated with personalities such as Sharif Hussein of Mecca and the British officer T. E. Lawrence, was later heavily romanticized. In fact, it was a complicated web of Arab hopes for independence, British war aims, and imperial promises. London made promises to Arab leaders, but at the same time negotiated with France about a partition of Ottoman territories. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 showed that the European powers were already thinking about zones of influence in the Middle East during the war. To the outside world, there was talk of liberation, behind the scenes of control, borders, and strategic benefit. Many conflicts in the later history of the Middle East were shaped by this contradictory policy. The situation of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire was particularly tragic. During the war, the Young Turk leadership regarded large parts of the Armenian population as a security risk and suspected them of cooperation with Russia. From 1915 onwards, there were deportations, massacres, death marches, and systematic violence, which is now recognized by many states and historians as genocide against the Armenians. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians died as a result of shootings, starvation, thirst, disease, and mistreatment. The war provided the framework in which an already radicalized national policy turned into mass extermination. This crime shows that the First World War not only meant military violence between armies, but also produced extreme violence against civilian populations. The war also had consequences in Asia and the Pacific. Japan entered the war on the side of the Entente and seized the opportunity to take over German possessions in China and the Pacific. The German-leased city of Qingdao was attacked and conquered by Japanese and British forces. Japan thus strengthened its position in East Asia and the Pacific. For China, on the other hand, the war became a bitter experience of international inequality. Although China later sided with the Allies and Chinese workers provided important services in Europe, its expectations were disappointed after the war when German rights in Shandong were not returned to China, but awarded to Japan. This contributed to the Chinese protest movement of 1919 and showed that the slogans of self-determination were often applied only selectively. The global war was also a war of raw materials and labor. Rubber, oil, cotton, metals, food, and animals were brought in from colonial and dependent territories. Workers from China, Vietnam, Egypt, and other regions were used for transport, construction, supply, and repairs. They were often not at the center of war narratives, but were indispensable for the war machine. Without colonial labor, many armies would hardly have been able to maintain their supply systems. The First World War was therefore not only global because there was fighting everywhere, but because the entire world economy was drawn into the war. This global expansion also changed the political consciousness of many people outside Europe. They saw that the European powers, which presented themselves as carriers of order, civilization, and progress, were fighting each other in an unprecedented war. Europe's moral superiority was severely damaged as a result. Colonial soldiers and workers who came to Europe saw the vulnerability and brutality of the imperial powers up close. After the war, demands for reforms, rights, and independence grew in many colonies. The war had mobilized people, politicized them, and raised expectations that the colonial powers later fulfilled only insufficiently. The term World War therefore means more than a geographical extension. It describes a new form of interdependence. An assassination attempt in the Balkans led to fighting in Flanders, East Prussia, Gallipoli, Mesopotamia, East Africa, the Pacific, and the oceans. Decisions in London, Berlin, Paris, Vienna, Istanbul, or St. Petersburg determined the lives of farmers in Africa, workers in China, soldiers from India, Bedouins in the Arabian desert, and families in the colonies. The world was so closely connected by empires, trade, ships, cables, banks and military alliances that a European war almost inevitably had global consequences. In the end, the war shook the imperial orders, even though many colonial empires remained in place for the time being. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. Germany's colonies were lost. Britain and France expanded their influence in the Middle East, but at the same time faced growing anti-colonial expectations. Japan gained power in East Asia. In India, China, Egypt, Korea, Vietnam, and many other regions, political movements intensified that increasingly challenged European hegemony. The First World War had not immediately liberated the world, but it had shown that the old order was vulnerable. The war became global because the powers were global. Their empires, fleets, trade routes, and claims drew millions of people into a conflict that was not theirs and yet changed their lives. He showed the reach of European power, but also its moral crisis. For while the government spoke of law, freedom, and defense, they used colonies as a reservoir of men and material, made promises that they later broke, and decided on territories whose inhabitants were hardly asked. Thus, the First World War became not only the downfall of an old European order, but also a turning point in the history of the colonial world. The consequences of this global war extended far beyond 1918 and shaped the entire 20th century. Chapter 12: Revolutions and Collapse in the East. In 1917, World War I began to change in a way that few had foreseen in the summer of 1914. It was not a great victory on the battlefield, not a single offensive, and not a diplomatic breakthrough that brought the first major turning point, but the internal collapse of one of the most powerful empires in Europe. Russia, the huge Tsarist empire that had fought on the side of France and Great Britain against Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire since the beginning of the war, fell into a revolutionary crisis under the weight of the war. The front in the East was not only a military space. It became a political earthquake that was to permanently change the war, Europe, and world history. Russia had already been an empire full of tensions before 1914. The Tsar ruled autocratically, political reforms remained limited, and society was characterized by strong contrasts. A small elite had great influence, while millions of peasants lived in poverty and workers in the cities worked in harsh conditions. The revolution of 1905 had shown how deep the discontent was. At that time, the regime had survived and made certain concessions, such as the establishment of the Duma, but the fundamental problems remained. The state was cumbersome, the administration often inefficient, the army huge but poorly supplied, and trust between government and population fragile. The war exacerbated all these weaknesses. Initially, Russia had also experienced a wave of patriotic approval. Many people believed that the fatherland had to be defended against Germany and Austria-Hungary, and the role of protector of the Slavs in the Balkans gave the war additional emotional meaning. But this mood did not last long. The defeats of 1914 and 1915, the enormous losses, and the retreat from Poland and Galicia shook confidence in the military leadership. Millions of Russian soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. At the front, there was a lack of rifles, ammunition, boots, food, and medical care. Some units had to wait until fallen comrades left their weapons. Whether such conditions were equally dramatic everywhere hardly played a role in the mood. The decisive factor was the feeling of being sent into an endless war by an incompetent state. The Tsar took a momentous step in 1915 when he himself took over the supreme command of the army. Nicholas II wanted to show strength and bear personal responsibility for the war. But politically, this was a serious mistake. As long as the generals could be held solely responsible for defeats, the monarchy remained at least partially protected. Now, however, every military crisis was directly linked to the Tsar's reputation. If the front failed, the Tsar himself failed. While he was at headquarters, the government in Petrograd remained unstable, and the Tsarina Alexandra gained influence at court. Her German origin made her suspicious in the eyes of many Russians in a time of war against Germany. In addition, there was the court's proximity to Grigory Rasputin, a mystical cleric who attracted rumors, hatred, and ridicule because of his influence on the Tsar's family. Whether Rasputin actually had as much power as his opponents claimed was less important than the effect. For many, he became a symbol of a rotten, aloof, and incompetent rule. The supply crisis in the cities became more and more threatening. Petrograd, Moscow, and other centers suffered from food shortages, rising prices, and transport problems. Russia continued to produce food, but the war overloaded railways and administration. Trains transported soldiers, weapons, and supplies, while bread and coal were lacking in the cities. Workers had to work long shifts, suffered from inflation, and at the same time saw how the war did not bring tangible progress. Women stood in queues for hours in front of bakeries, often without being sure whether there would be bread left at the end. Hunger is politically dangerous because it transforms abstract discontent into immediate despair. Those who cannot feed their children lose confidence in every slogan of perseverance. In February 1917, according to the Russian calendar, in March according to the Western calendar, the crisis broke out openly. Protests began in Petrograd, initially strongly supported by women and workers, who demanded bread and demonstrated against the unbearable living conditions. Strikes turned into mass demonstrations. The calls were soon no longer directed only against hunger, but against the war and against the Tsar. The decisive factor was that the soldiers in the capital no longer acted reliably against the demonstrators. Many of them were farmers or workers in uniform themselves, tired of war and poorly cared for. When parts of the garrison mutinied and sided with the protesters, the regime lost its most important support. An autocracy can survive many crises as long as the army and police obey. In Petrograd, this was no longer the case. Nicholas II still tried to maintain control, but the connection between the court, government, parliament, and army had already been broken. Leading politicians and military officials came to the conclusion that the Tsar could no longer be held. In March 1917, Nicholas II abdicated. This ended the centuries-long rule of the Romanovs. The overthrow of the Tsar was a huge event, but it did not solve Russia's problems. The old order was replaced by an uncertain dual power. On the one hand, there was the provisional government, which emerged from liberal and moderate forces and wanted to lead Russia into a more parliamentary future. On the other hand, Soviets emerged, i.e. councils of workers and soldiers, which had great influence, especially in Petrograd. This dual structure made clear decisions difficult. Who spoke for Russia? The government? The councillors? The army? The road? The decisive question remained the war. Many people had hoped that the overthrow of the Tsar would also open the way to peace. But the provisional government continued the war. There were several reasons for this. Russia was tied to its allies France and Great Britain. An immediate separate peace would have been considered treason and would have weakened Russia's international position. In addition, many moderate politicians hoped that a democratic Russia could now continue the war in defense of the revolution and freedom. But this idea was met with an exhausted population and a disintegrating army. For many soldiers at the front, it was not decisive whether they should fight for the Tsar or for a new government. They wanted to go home, to their families, to the fields, to a world without grenades and hunger. In the summer of 1917, the provisional government under Alexander Kerensky once again tried to improve the military situation and boost morale through an offensive. This Kerensky offensive began with hopes, but ended in disaster. The Russian army was too weakened internally, discipline and trust were shaken, soldiers' councils interfered in military decisions, and many units were no longer willing to make heavy sacrifices for unclear goals. When the offensive collapsed, the government's crisis intensified. The front became more and more unstable, desertions increased, and in the countryside peasants began to occupy estates of the nobility or to divide up land on their own authority. Russia was not only in a government crisis, but in a social revolution. In this situation, the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin gained influence. Lenin had returned to Russia from exile in April 1917. His demands were clear, radical, and understandable for many exhausted people: peace, land, and bread. While other parties hesitated, sought compromises or wanted to continue the war, the Bolsheviks promised a break with the old order. They demanded all power to the Soviets, immediate peace, and the redistribution of the country. These slogans had an extraordinarily strong effect in a society torn apart by war, hunger, and inequality. The Bolsheviks were not capable of winning a majority everywhere from the outset, but they understood the dynamics of the crisis better than many of their opponents. In October 1917, according to the Russian calendar, in November according to the Western calendar, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd. The coup was relatively orderly in the capital, but was of enormous political importance. The provisional government was overthrown, and a new Bolshevik government under Lenin began to secure its power. But the seizure of power was not the end of the crisis, but the beginning of a new struggle. Russia faced civil war, economic collapse, national independence movements, and the question of how to actually achieve the promised peace. For the Central Powers, it was clear that now was the opportunity to push Russia out of the war and free up forces for the West. Peace negotiations began in Brest-Litovsk, a city in present-day Belarus. There, representatives of the new Bolshevik government met with the Central Powers. For Lenin, peace was vital. He knew that Bolshevik rule could hardly survive as long as the war continued. The army was disintegrating, the economy was on the ground, and the population was expecting an end to the bloodshed. But the price was high. Germany and Austria-Hungary wanted not only peace, but also territorial and political advantages. They demanded the separation of large areas from the former Tsarist Empire, including Poland, Lithuania, Courland, parts of Livonia, Estonia, Finland, and Ukraine in various forms of political dependence or secession. For Russia, this meant a huge loss of population, land, raw materials, and economic power. Within the Bolshevik leadership, peace was disputed. Some wanted to continue a revolutionary war, others hoped to delay the negotiations until revolutions would also break out in Germany or Austria-Hungary. Leon Trotsky, who led the negotiations, at times tried a formula of neither war nor peace. Russia declared the war over, but did not want to sign the hard treaty. The German leadership reacted with military pressure. In February 1918, German troops continued to advance and hardly encountered any organized resistance. This made it clear that the Bolsheviks had no real military alternative. Lenin prevailed. Peace had to be accepted, as bitter as it was. On March 3, 1918, the Peace of Brest-Litovsk was signed. For the Central Powers, it was a great success in the East. Russia withdrew from the war, and Germany could hope to transfer troops to the Western Front. For the Bolsheviks, the treaty was a humiliation, but at the same time a decision to survive. Lenin was willing to give up space in order to gain time. He believed that the revolution could only be saved if the war ended. In fact, peace allowed the Bolsheviks to concentrate more on the internal power struggle. Shortly thereafter, Russia plunged into a bloody civil war between Reds, Whites, nationalist movements, foreign intervention troops, and local forces. Brest-Litovsk had direct consequences for the First World War. Germany could now place great hopes on a decision in the West. The German leadership under Hindenburg and Ludendorff believed that they would be able to launch a final offensive in the spring of 1918 with the forces that were freed up before the American troops arrived in full force. The victory in the East seemed to open up the chance to win the war after all. But this impression was deceptive. Although Russia had withdrawn, Germany had to continue to control occupied areas, organize supplies, and leave troops in the East. In addition, their own society was exhausted, the economy weakened by blockade and shortage, and time was working for the Allies. The collapse in the East also changed the political map of Europe. Finland, Poland, the Baltic territories, Ukraine, and other regions were caught in movements between independence, occupation, civil war, and foreign influence. Old imperial structures disintegrated, new states and claims emerged. But many of these developments remained uncertain because the outcome of the World War was still open. When Germany itself collapsed in November 1918, the Peace of Brest-Litovsk became invalid. The German defeat once again opened up the space for conflicts, border wars, and restructuring. After 1918, Eastern Europe did not simply become peaceful, but remained an area of enormous insecurity. The revolutions in Russia show how closely war and internal order were linked. The First World War did not bring down the Tsarist Empire alone, but it exacerbated all the crises that already existed. Hunger, military defeats, social inequality, political incompetence, and the loss of trust combined to form a revolutionary explosion. The people wanted bread, land, peace, and dignity. The old monarchy could not offer them any of this convincingly. The provisional government was unable to end the war and lost its credibility as a result. The Bolsheviks won because they gave the most radical answer to the most urgent questions. The collapse of Russia was both a warning and a hope for other countries. For the governments of the Central Powers and the Entente, it was a sign of what could happen when war fatigue, hunger, and political discontent got out of control. For workers' movements and revolutionary groups in Europe, it was proof that an old order could be overthrown. The Russian Revolution thus became an event that had an impact far beyond the war. It not only changed the military course, but also opened a new ideological epoch. The conflict between communism, liberal democracy, conservative forces, and later fascist movements was to have a profound impact on the 20th century. In the East, the war did not end with a clear victory in the classical sense, but with revolution, separate peace, and disintegration. Russia left the World War, but it did not find peace. Germany won in the East, but it did not win the World War. Austria-Hungary was relieved at short notice, but remained weakened internally. The peoples of Eastern Europe saw opportunities for national self-determination, but at the same time came under new violence. What had begun in 1914 as a war of the empires caused entire empires to break up in 1917 and 1918. The East thus became the laboratory of the political 20th century. This showed that modern wars can not only destroy armies, but also blow up states. Here, war fatigue gave rise to revolution, revolution to civil war, imperial decay to a new map, and the slogan of peace to a new form of radical power politics. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk ended the World War for Russia, but it opened an even greater historical upheaval. The First World War had not only shifted fronts in the East. He had brought down a world. Chapter 13: America's Entry into the War. When World War I began in the summer of 1914, the United States of America initially stood on the sidelines. For many Americans, the war was a European conflict, born of old alliances, dynastic interests, border issues, and imperial rivalries that seemed to have little to do with their own country. President Woodrow Wilson declared U.S. neutrality and urged its citizens to remain impartial not only politically but also internally. That was easier said than done. The United States was a country of immigration, with millions of people having family, cultural, and emotional ties to Europe. German Americans, Irish Americans, British Americans, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, Italians, Poles, and many others viewed the war differently. But despite these diverse ties, the majority of the population initially did not want to be drawn into the European war. Wilson saw himself as a representative of a moral foreign policy. He believed that America could play a special role in the world, not as a classical conquering power, but as a mediator, as a force of law and international order. This idea was idealistic, but not free of self-interest. The USA had long been a great economic power. Their industry produced on a huge scale, their banks gained in importance, their trade connected them closely with the world. Even if America remained neutral, it was not untouched. The war in Europe changed markets, financial flows, shipping routes, and political expectations. Neutrality did not mean absence, but a difficult balance between distance and interdependence. As the war progressed, this balance shifted. The British naval blockade made trade with Germany and the Central Powers more difficult. At the same time, Britain and France bought American goods, food, raw materials, weapons, and ammunition on a large scale. American banks granted loans to the Allies. This created economic ties that made the neutrality of the USA practically more and more one-sided. Formally, the United States was not at war, but its economy became increasingly linked to the endurance of the Entente. If Great Britain or France were to lose, American loans and trade interests would also have been endangered. This economic interdependence was not the sole reason for war, but it formed an important background. The decisive conflict between the USA and Germany originated at sea. Britain was dependent on imports, and Germany was looking for ways to hit this lifeline. The submarine appeared as a weapon with which British superiority at sea could be circumvented. However, the use of submarines against merchant ships brought Germany into conflict with neutral states, especially the United States. American citizens traveled on ships, American goods were transported, American sailors were on the seas. From the American point of view, when German submarines sank ships without warning, it called into question the freedom of the seas, a principle that was of great importance for trade, security, and national honor. The sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915 became a turning point in American perception. The British passenger ship was torpedoed by a German submarine and sank off Ireland. More than 1,000 people died, including American citizens. Germany defended its actions by pointing to wartime cargo and the British use of civilian ships in the war. But horror prevailed among the American public. The idea of civilians, women, and children dying from an attack from the depths of the sea was like a moral shock. Wilson initially reacted not with war, but with diplomatic pressure. He demanded that Germany respect the rights of neutral states and civilian passengers. Berlin temporarily backed away because it wanted to avoid the U.S. entering the war. However, this reluctance was controversial in Germany. The British blockade increasingly constricted the Central Powers. Hunger, shortages of raw materials, and economic exhaustion increased. In the German military leadership, the conviction grew that only a ruthless submarine war could force Britain to peace quickly enough. The calculation was dangerous. If German submarines sank enough merchant ships, Great Britain would collapse economically before the USA could intervene militarily decisively after a possible entry into the war. This strategy was based on time pressure, desperation, and an underestimation of American capabilities. It was a game of chance with global political consequences. In January 1917, Germany decided to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. From February, ships in certain war zones were to be sunk without warning, even neutral ones. In doing so, Berlin posed a direct challenge to the United States. Wilson initially broke off diplomatic relations, but hesitated to declare war. He knew that entering the war was a huge step. The USA was not yet sufficiently prepared militarily compared to the European mass armies. In addition, there were still strong isolationist and pacifist voices in the country. Many Americans did not want their sons to die in the trenches of Europe. Then came the Zimmermann Dispatch. German State Secretary Arthur Zimmermann had promised Mexico an alliance in the event of a war between Germany and the United States. In return, Mexico was to be offered the recovery of lost territories such as Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. British intelligence intercepted the cable and passed it on to the United States. When its content became public, it outraged the American public. Even if Mexico would hardly have been realistically able to wage such a war successfully, the dispatch seemed like proof of German hostility on the American continent. It hurt the USA's sense of security and reinforced the impression that Germany was acting recklessly and dangerously. On April 2, 1917, Wilson appeared before Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Germany. He did not portray the war as a war of conquest, but as a struggle for law, democracy, and a more peaceful world order. His formulation that the world must be made safe for democracy became particularly famous. These words gave a moral framework to the American entry into the war. Wilson did not simply want to support the Allies, but to turn the war into a struggle for principles: freedom of the seas, self-determination, international law, open diplomacy, and an international order that would prevent future wars. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. For the Allies, America's entry was a huge boost of hope. France and Great Britain were exhausted after almost 3 years of war. Their armies had suffered enormous losses, their societies were tired, their finances strained. Russia, previously an important ally in the East, had become insecure due to revolution and internal crisis. The entry of the USA therefore did not immediately mean new armies of millions at the front, but it meant time, material, money, industry, and moral reinforcement. The very prospect that America would mobilize its vast resources changed strategic thinking. The Entente could hope to hold out longer than the Central Powers. Germany, on the other hand, now found itself in an even more difficult situation. The military leadership knew that the U.S. would not be immediately decisive. It took time to train soldiers, provide ships, produce equipment, and bring troops to Europe. This is precisely why the time factor gained dramatic significance in 1917 and 1918. Germany had to try to decide the war before American power was fully effective. This consideration later led directly to the German spring offensives of 1918. The American entry thus not only had a long-term effect, but also immediately influenced the strategy of the Central Powers. The mobilization of the United States was a huge organizational task. The country had to build up a mass army, introduce conscription, set up camps, train officers, produce weapons, and secure transport routes across the Atlantic. General John J. Pershing became Commander-in-Chief of the American Expeditionary Forces. He insisted that American troops should be used as an independent army if possible and not fully integrated into British or French units. This had political and symbolic significance. America did not want to be just an auxiliary force, but to act as an independent power. At the same time, American soldiers had to learn from the experience of the European armies, because they encountered a war that had been a cruel school of modern destruction for years. For the American soldiers, Europe was a shock. Many came from rural regions or cities that had previously only learned about the war from newspapers. They were now confronted with trenches, gas alarms, artillery fire, destroyed villages, and an exhausted European civilian population. At first, many were inexperienced, but their fresh strength was of great importance. They not only brought new bodies to the front, but also new self-confidence. For French soldiers who had been fighting since 1914, the arrival of American troops was a sign that the war might still be won. For German soldiers, it was an ominous signal that the enemy was not weakening, but getting stronger. The war also changed the United States domestically. The state intervened more strongly in the economy and society. Propaganda promoted war bonds, food savings, and national unity. Critics of the war were put under pressure, and laws against espionage and sedition restricted freedom of expression. Some German-born Americans came under suspicion, and the German language and culture were viewed with suspicion in some areas. At the same time, women, African Americans, and immigrants worked in industries important to the war effort. The great migration of many African Americans from the South to the industrial centers of the North was intensified by the war economy. So the war also changed America itself, not just its role in the world. Wilson combined the entry into the war with a vision for the post-war order. In January 1918, he formulated his 14 points. They contained ideas such as open treaties, freedom of the seas, the dismantling of trade barriers, arms limitation, fair settlements of colonial issues, national self-determination, and the establishment of a League of Nations. These points were read attentively worldwide. For many peoples in Europe and the colonies, they sounded like a promise of a more just order. But they also contained tensions and ambiguities. Self-determination was difficult to implement unambiguously in ethnically mixed regions. Colonial interests of the victorious powers stood in the way of idealistic words. Nevertheless, Wilson's ideas gave a new moral claim to the War of the Allies. Militarily, American power became more and more noticeable in 1918. Although the British and French armies continued to bear the brunt of many battles, the growing number of American troops changed the balance of power. In battles such as Belleau Wood, St. Mihiel, and later in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, American units showed their increasing importance. Their losses were severe, their experience limited at first, but their presence made it clear that the Entente had reserves that Germany could no longer compensate for. While the Central Powers were suffering from hunger, blockade, material shortages, and war fatigue, the Allies were now backed by the industrial and demographic power of the United States. The American entry was not the only reason for the Allied victory, but it was a decisive factor. He gave the exhausted Entente powers economic and moral strength, intensified the time pressure on Germany, and made it clear that a German victory was becoming increasingly unlikely. In 1918, the German leadership staked everything on a final offensive, precisely because they knew that American power was growing with each passing month. When this offensive failed, the strategic position of the Central Powers could hardly be saved. America's entry into the war also changed world politics beyond the war. The United States entered the role of a decisive world power from a position of relative distance. Although the country partially withdrew domestically after the war and ultimately did not join the League of Nations desired by Wilson, the Old World could no longer be thought of without America. Europe's great powers had exhausted themselves in a years-long war, while the USA emerged from the conflict as a financially, industrially, and politically ascended power. America's path to war shows how an initially European conflict became global through trade, naval power, diplomacy, and morality. The United States did not enter because of a single event, but through a growing chain of developments: economic ties to the Allies, the German U-boat war, the Lusitania, the Zimmermann Dispatch, the question of neutral rights, and Wilson's claim to create a new international order. In the end, America fought not only against Germany, but for an idea of what the world should look like after this war. Whether this idea was fulfilled remained another question. But from 1917, it was clear that the First World War could no longer be decided without the United States. Chapter 14: The Last Year of the War. The year 1918 began with a dangerous mixture of hope, exhaustion, and despair. After almost 4 years of war, all the companies involved were badly scarred. Millions of soldiers were dead, wounded, or taken prisoner. Cities and villages lived with grief and want, and on the fronts entire landscapes had been transformed into destroyed zones. But militarily, there seemed to be another opportunity for Germany to decide the war. Russia had withdrawn from the war after the revolution and peace of Brest-Litovsk. In the east, the Central Powers had apparently won, and German troops could be transferred to the Western Front. At the same time, it was clear that the United States would bring more and more soldiers and material to Europe. For the German leadership, this created a tight time corridor. If the war is still to be won, it will be immediately, before American power is finally effective. In the meantime, the real power in the German Reich was increasingly in the hands of the Supreme Army Command under Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. Although the Emperor continued to be at the head of the empire, the military leadership determined the decisive questions of war and politics. Ludendorff knew that Germany was economically and socially exhausted. The British naval blockade continued to have an effect. Food was scarce, raw materials were lacking, and the mood at home became more fragile. Nevertheless, he relied on one last huge offensive in the West. It was intended to break through the Allied lines, separate the British and French armies from each other, and if possible force a political or military collapse before American troops could intervene in large numbers. On March 21, 1918, the German Spring Offensive began, which became known as Operation Michael. It was initially directed against the sector between British and French forces on the Western Front. The attack began with a massive artillery strike. Unlike in earlier offensives, the German artillery did not only rely on long barrages, but on shorter, concentrated, and more precisely planned strikes against positions, batteries, connections, and command points. After that, specially trained shock troops advanced. These units should not stubbornly run against the strongest pockets of resistance, but seek out weak points, bypass them, penetrate deep, and cause confusion behind the lines. It was an attempt to bring movement back into the ossified trench warfare. In the beginning, the offense was actually successful. The German troops broke through parts of the British front and gained more ground than in many previous years combined. The Allies retreated. Streets were full of soldiers, guns, wounded, refugees, and supply columns. For a short time, it seemed as if Germany could force a decision after all. In Berlin and in the German public, hope germinated. After years of hunger and losses, some believed that the longed-for victory was finally within reach. But this success already had its own limits. The German soldiers were exhausted, the supply routes lengthened, horses and vehicles could hardly keep up, and the destroyed terrain made any further advance difficult. The basic problem of the offensive was that it gained ground, but did not make a clear strategic decision. The German units advanced deeply, but they could not separate or destroy the British and French armies. The further they got, the more difficult it became to bring ammunition, food, and reinforcements. Many soldiers found food, alcohol, and equipment in abandoned Allied camps, which showed how poor German supplies had become. The advance lost momentum. The shock troops, i.e. the best and most experienced forces, suffered heavy losses. These men could hardly be replaced. Germany gained space, but lost strength. In the months that followed, the German leadership attempted further offensives. Names such as Georgette, Blücher, York, and Gneisenau stood for new attacks on various sections of the Western Front. Again and again they succeeded in pushing back the Allies, but never achieved the decisive breakthrough. It became particularly dangerous when German troops advanced again towards the Marne in the spring and early summer, and Paris seemed threatened again. The situation was outwardly reminiscent of 1914, but the strategic reality was different. The Allies had learned from previous years. Their defense was more flexible, their coordination improved, and a joint Allied Supreme Command was created with Ferdinand Foch. This more unified management helped to deploy reserves in a more targeted manner and to overcome crises more quickly. At the same time, the American troops became increasingly important. They were not yet experienced everywhere, but their number grew. For the exhausted French and British, their presence meant an enormous moral boost. For Germany, it was a sign that time was finally working against the Central Powers. Every month brought more American soldiers, more material, more trucks, more industrial power. The German leadership had hoped to decide the war before this current became too strong. But the spring offensives used up the last German reserves without breaking the opponent. In July 1918, the turning point came. The Second Battle of the Marne was a decisive setback for Germany. The Allies withstood the German attack and then counterattacked themselves. Now it became clear that the German army had passed its peak. Their soldiers were tired, many units were thinned out, supplies were poor, morale was weak. The belief in victory, which had flared up again in March, began to fade. More and more soldiers realized that the great sacrifices of the last offensive had not brought the hope for peace, but only new losses. On August 8, 1918, an Allied attack began near Amiens, which Ludendorff later described as the Black Day of the German Army. British, Australian, Canadian, French, and other Allied forces used artillery, infantry, aircraft, and tanks in a better coordinated manner than before. The attack hit the German lines hard. Many soldiers surrendered, entire sections were pushed back, and the German leadership had to realize that the army no longer had the old resilience. Amiens was not the end of the war, but it showed that the initiative was now clearly with the Allies. This was followed by the so-called 100-day offensive. The Allies pushed the German troops back step by step. Unlike previous offensives, this phase did not consist of a single powerful attack, which was soon exhausted, but of a sequence of coordinated strikes on different sections of the front. The Germans had to evade again and again, move into new lines, leave material behind, and accept losses. The famous Hindenburg Line, which had been considered a strong defensive system, was breached in the autumn of 1918. With each retreat, the hope for a favorable peace faded. The German army was not yet completely destroyed, but it could no longer win the war. Meanwhile, Germany's allies disintegrated. Bulgaria was forced to sign an armistice in September 1918 after Allied successes in the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire was militarily and economically exhausted and concluded the Armistice of Mudros in October. Austria-Hungary, already torn apart by national tensions, broke up in the autumn of 1918. Czechs, South Slavs, Poles, Hungarians, and other groups sought their own future outside the Habsburg monarchy. The army of the multi-ethnic empire lost its internal cohesion, while on the Italian front the defeat of Vittorio Veneto accelerated the collapse. At the beginning of November, Austria also asked Hungary for a ceasefire. The Old Reich, which had started the war in 1914 with the attack on Serbia, practically no longer existed. In Germany itself, the crisis came to a dramatic head. The population continued to suffer from hunger, shortages, and war fatigue. The military leadership, which had relied on victory for years, suddenly realized at the end of September that a ceasefire was necessary. Ludendorff now urged a parliamentary government to submit a request for peace to the Allies. There was also a political calculation behind this. The responsibility for the lost war should not lie solely with the military leadership. Civilian politicians were now to negotiate the ceasefire, although the decisive military and political course had previously been set by the Supreme Army Command. Here lay a germ of that later legend, according to which the army was supposedly undefeated in the field and had been betrayed by the homeland. The new government under Prince Max of Baden turned to American President Woodrow Wilson and hoped for peace on the basis of his 14 points. Wilson's ideas promised self-determination, open diplomacy, and a new peace order. But the Allies were not prepared to simply grant Germany lenient conditions as long as its army was still on foreign soil. At the same time, they demanded political changes. The German monarchy came under increasing pressure. The question was no longer just when the war would end, but whether the empire could survive. The immediate trigger of the revolution came from the Navy. At the end of October 1918, the German Naval Command planned a final naval advance against Great Britain. Many sailors saw this as a senseless sacrifice. Why should they die shortly before the end of the war, just so that the fleet could prove its honor in one last battle? In Wilhelmshaven and Kiel, sailors refused to obey the order. Mutiny turned into a political movement. Workers' and soldiers' councils emerged, demonstrations spread, red flags were raised, and demands for peace, bread, and political change grew louder and louder. The revolution spread to other cities. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated or was effectively pressured to abdicate. The Republic was proclaimed in Berlin. Within a few days, the monarchical order that had shaped the German Empire since 1871 collapsed. For many people, this moment was liberation. For others, shock. For others, chaos. The war had not only exhausted Germany's external power, but also destroyed the internal legitimacy of the empire. As before in Russia, it was also shown that a modern total war could blow up states from within when hunger, defeat, social tension, and loss of political trust coincided. On November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed in the forest of Compiègne. At 11 a.m., the guns on the Western Front fell silent. For the soldiers, this moment was hard to comprehend. After years of noise, fear, and killing, silence suddenly fell. But it was not an easy joy. Millions were dead, wounded lay in hospitals, prisoners waited to return home, families mourned, and entire regions were destroyed. The armistice was not the final peace, but the end of the fighting. The political, moral, and territorial questions remained open. The last year of the war showed the full tragedy of the First World War. At the beginning of 1918, Germany was apparently faced with another chance and ended in collapse. The spring offensives were militarily impressive, but strategically desperate. They used up the last reserves without forcing the decision. The Allies survived the crisis, gathered their forces, and from the summer of 1918, used their material, personnel, and organizational superiority. The Central Powers disintegrated one after the other, not only through defeats at the front, but through hunger, national tensions, political exhaustion, and the loss of faith in victory. 1918 was therefore not simply the year in which the war ended. It was the year in which the old orders of Europe finally visibly collapsed. The Tsarist Empire had already fallen. The Ottoman Empire was on the verge of dissolution. Austria-Hungary disappeared, and the German Empire became a republic. The war had begun as a conflict between empires and ended with their downfall. But the silence of the guns did not yet result in a stable peace. The treaties, borders, questions of guilt and humiliations of the coming years would create new tensions. On November 11, 1918, the killing at the front ended. The consequences of the war, however, had only just begun. Chapter 15: Versailles and the Aftermath. When the guns fell silent on November 11, 1918, Europe had not really arrived at peace. The fronts fell silent, but beneath the surface lay grief, hunger, hatred, fear, and political uncertainty. Millions of people had fallen, millions more wounded, maimed, or mentally destroyed. Entire landscapes in northern France, Belgium, Poland, Galicia, Serbia, and other regions were devastated. Villages no longer existed. Fields were littered with shell craters. Forests lay in the earth as black stumps, and in many families there was an empty space that could never be filled again. The war was over, but its weight was on every negotiating table, in every capital, and in every memory. The victors were now faced with a task that was almost impossible. They had to create a new order for a continent whose old order was broken. 4 great empires had collapsed or been severely shaken at the end of the war: the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. In their place, republics, new states, revolutionary movements, civil wars, and border conflicts emerged. So peace not only had to end the war, but also create a completely new political map. But the interests of the victors were different, and their ideas of justice contradicted each other. In January 1919, the Paris Peace Conference began. The representatives of the victorious powers met there to decide on the future of Europe and the world. Particularly influential were American President Woodrow Wilson, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando. Each of them brought their own goals with them. Wilson spoke of a new world order, of self-determination of peoples, open diplomatic action, and a League of Nations that would prevent future wars. Clemenceau, on the other hand, was thinking above all about France's security. France had lost to Germany in 1870, suffered again from German attack from 1914 to 1918, and saw large parts of its northeast devastated. For Clemenceau, it was clear that Germany had to be weakened to such an extent that it could never threaten France again. Great Britain took an intermediate position. Lloyd George wanted to punish Germany, but not destroy it completely. A Germany that was too weak could destabilize Europe economically and make France too powerful. In addition, Germany had been an important trading partner before the war. Great Britain wanted to eliminate the German fleet, secure its own position as a world power, and at the same time maintain a balance on the continent. Italy, on the other hand, expected territorial gains that had been promised to it during the war, but later felt disappointed by the peace settlements. Even in these different interests, it became clear that peace would not arise from a uniform moral idea, but from power politics, security thinking, national expectations, and compromises. Germany was not invited to the decisive negotiations on an equal footing. The German delegation was later confronted with the conditions and could only raise limited objections. In Germany, this reinforced the feeling of being at the mercy of a diktat. Many Germans had hoped that peace would be based on Wilson's 14 points. This hope was not entirely unfounded, because the German government had asked for an armistice in the autumn of 1918 because Wilson's program sounded comparatively moderate. But the final treaty contained conditions that were perceived as harsh, humiliating, and unjust in Germany. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Sarajevo. Even this date was symbolic. Germany had to cede territories. Alsace-Lorraine came back to France. Eupen-Malmedy fell to Belgium. North Schleswig was partially awarded to Denmark after a referendum. In the east, new borders were created, especially in favor of the re-established Poland. The so-called Polish Corridor gave Poland access to the Baltic Sea, but separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Danzig became a free city under the protection of the League of Nations. The Saar region was placed under international administration for a certain period of time, and its coal production benefited France. All German colonies were also lost and were distributed as mandate territories among the victorious powers. The military regulations weighed particularly heavily. The German army was limited to 100,000 men. General conscription was banned. Germany was not allowed to possess heavy weapons such as tanks, heavy artillery, submarines, or air forces. The Rhineland was demilitarized so that France would have a security zone against Germany. These regulations were intended to prevent Germany from quickly becoming an aggressive military power again. From France's point of view, they were a necessary security measure. From the German point of view, they seemed like a permanent humiliation and an attempt to make the country defenseless. Even more controversial were the demands for reparations and the question of war guilt. Article 231 of the treaty declared Germany and its allies responsible for the damage caused by the war. This article served as the legal basis for reparation payments. In Germany, it was understood as a moral assignment of sole blame, even if the wording was intended to establish liability for damages in legal terms. The effect was devastating. Many Germans found it unbearable to be held solely responsible for a war whose causes actually lay in a complex system of alliances, imperialism, militarism, nationalism, and wrong decisions by several powers. The fact that Germany had borne a central responsibility for the escalation in 1914 was often suppressed or denied by the German public. Instead, the feeling of national humiliation arose. The reparations became a permanent political conflict. France and Belgium demanded compensation for destroyed regions, factories, railways, and cities. Their demands were understandable from their experience. Germany, in turn, suffered from economic uncertainty, inflation, political instability, and the loss of important resources. Many people believed that the burden of reparations was strangling the young republic. The dispute over payments, deliveries, and deadlines strained relations between Germany and the victorious powers for years. The occupation of the Ruhr in 1923 in particular showed how explosive this question remained. When Germany fell behind on deliveries, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr area. Passive resistance, economic consequences, and hyperinflation severely shook the Weimar Republic. But Versailles was not the only peace treaty. The Treaty of Saint-Germain was concluded with Austria, the Treaty of Trianon with Hungary, Neuilly with Bulgaria, and Sèvres with the Ottoman Empire, and later Lausanne after the Turkish War of Independence. These treaties reorganized large parts of Europe and the Middle East. Austria-Hungary disappeared from the map. States such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which was later to be called Yugoslavia, emerged or expanded. The idea of national self-determination played an important role in this, but it could hardly be implemented cleanly in ethnically mixed regions. Millions of people suddenly found themselves as minorities in new states. Germans, Hungarians, Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, and many others lived in areas whose new borders could not do justice to everyone. These new borders were supposed to bring peace, but often created new tensions. Poland argued with neighbors over borders. Hungary perceived Trianon as a national catastrophe because it lost large territories. Many German-speaking people lived in Czechoslovakia, especially in the Sudetenland. In the new Yugoslavia, very different peoples, religions, and political traditions had to come together in one state. In the Middle East, former Ottoman territories were organized under British and French mandates. Local expectations of independence were often disappointed. The Parisian order promised self-determination, but implemented it unevenly. For some peoples it meant national liberation, for others new heteronomy or minority problems. The League of Nations was to embody the great lesson of the war. Wilson hoped that an international organization would be able to resolve conflicts through negotiations and create collective security in the future. The idea was significant and forward-looking. But the League of Nations was weakened from the beginning. The United States itself did not join it because the U.S. Senate rejected Wilson's course. Germany and the Soviet Union were initially excluded. Without these great powers, the League of Nations would lack the strength to truly guarantee a stable world order. He could mediate, observe, and exert moral pressure, but he did not have sufficient means to stop determined aggressors in the long term. In Germany, Versailles met a young republic that came into being under the most difficult conditions imaginable. The Weimar Republic had emerged from defeat, revolution, and armistice. Many people did not associate it with democratic hope, but with military collapse, hunger, inflation, and national humiliation. Right-wing forces spread the stab-in-the-back legend, according to which the German army was allegedly not defeated militarily, but betrayed by revolutionaries, Democrats, socialists, and Jews at home. This claim was false, but politically effective. It exonerated the military leadership, poisoned confidence in democracy, and blamed the Republic for a defeat it had not caused. As a result, Versailles became a political battle cry. For democratic politicians, the treaty was a heavy burden that had to be dealt with in order to make Germany capable of acting internationally again. For nationalists, it was a symbol of shame that had to be destroyed. This mood was later exploited by radical movements, especially the National Socialists. Adolf Hitler and his followers made the hatred of Versailles a core of their propaganda. They promised rearmament, revision of borders, national rebirth, and revenge for the alleged humiliation. The treaty alone did not cause the rise of Nazism, but it provided powerful emotional and political material that enemies of democracy ruthlessly exploited. Nevertheless, it would be too easy to consider Versailles only as a direct path to the Second World War. The story was more open. In the 1920s, there were also phases of détente, for example through the treaties of Locarno, Germany's admission to the League of Nations, and international plans to regulate reparations. Many people hoped that Europe could gradually stabilize, but the foundations remained fragile. Economic crises, national resentments, unresolved minority issues, fear of Bolshevism, mistrust between states, and the world economic crisis from 1929 onwards destroyed much of the progress. Versailles was therefore not the sole cause of later catastrophes, but part of an unstable peace system that offered too little reconciliation and too little sustainable security. The consequences of the First World War reached far beyond treaties and borders. The war changed people's relationship to the state, technology, violence, and modernity. A generation had seen highly developed societies capable of killing millions of people on an industrial scale. Many soldiers returned traumatized and found themselves in a world that could hardly understand their experiences. Artists, writers, and intellectuals were looking for new forms to express the rupture. The belief in unstoppable progress was shaken. At the same time, radical political movements emerged that formed new ideologies out of war experience, disappointment, and a willingness to use violence. The war also accelerated the rise of the United States and the upheavals in Russia. America had become a decisive world power, even if it initially partially withdrew politically. The Russian Revolution had created the first socialist state and created an ideological challenge to the existing order. In Europe, conservative and bourgeois forces feared the spread of communism, while workers' movements and revolutionary groups hoped for change. The war had thus not only shifted borders, but also exacerbated the great political antagonisms of the 20th century. In the end, Versailles remains a symbol of the difficulty of creating a just peace after an all-out war. The victors wanted security, compensation, and order. The defeated felt humiliation, powerlessness, and injustice. New states hoped for self-determination, new minorities felt abandoned. Wilson dreamed of a world of law, Clemenceau demanded protection from German power, Lloyd George sought balance, and millions of ordinary people wanted above all bread, homecoming, and peace. These contradictory expectations resulted in a peace that ended the war but left many conflicts unresolved. The First World War had destroyed the old world. Versailles tried to build a new one from its ruins. But this new order stood on uncertain ground. It carried the memory of mass graves, hunger winters, revolutions, national humiliations, and broken promises. That is why the peace of 1919 was not a real final stroke, but a transition. The weapons had fallen silent, but the causes of mistrust, revenge, and power struggle had not disappeared. The shadow of the war hung over the entire interwar period. So the history of the First World War does not simply end with a contract hall in Versailles. It ends in the faces of the returnees, in the black clothes of the widows, in the empty villages, in new border posts, in political street battles, in hunger, hope, and bitterness. It ends up in a world that wanted peace, but did not know how to secure it in the long term. The war from 1914 to 1918 was over, but the century he had formed was only now beginning to unfold its full unrest.